Part 2. 1. In the early dawn, on the 25th day of August, the four men met behind the livery stable, where their wagon, loaded with 6 weeks' provisions, waited for them. A sleepy stableman, scratching his matted hair and cursing mechanically under his breath, yoked their oxen to the wagon. The oxen snorted and moved uneasily in the faint light cast by a lantern set on the ground. His task completed, the stableman grunted and turned away from the four men. He shambled back toward the livery stable, swinging the lantern carelessly beside him, and dropped upon a pile of filthy blankets that lay on the open ground outside. Lying on his side, he raised the glow of the lantern and blew out the flame. In the darkness, 3 of the men mounted their horses. The 4th clambered into the wagon. For a few moments none of them spoke or moved. In the silence and darkness the heavy breathing of the stableman came regular and deep, and the thin squeak of leather upon wood sounded as the oxen moved against their yokes. From the wagon Charlie Hoge cleared his throat and said, "Ready?" Miller sighed deeply and answered, his voice muffled and quiet, "Ready." Upon the silence came the sudden pop of braided leather as Charlie Hoge let his bullwhip out above the oxen, and his voice, shrill and explosive, cracked, "Harrop!" The oxen strained against the weight of the wagon, their hooves pawing and thudding dully in the earth. The wheels groaned against the hickory axles. For a moment there was a jumble of sound. Wood strained against its grain. Rawhide and leather slapped together and pulled in high, thin screeches, and metal jangled against metal. Then the sound gave way to an easy rumble as the wheels turned and the wagon slowly began to move behind the oxen. The 3 men preceded the wagon around the livery stable and into the wide dirt street of Butcher's Crossing. Miller rode first, slouched in his saddle. Behind him, forming a broad-based triangle, rode Schneider and Andrews. Still no one spoke. Miller looked ahead into the darkness that was gradually beginning to lift. Schneider kept his head down, as if he were asleep in his saddle, and Andrews looked on either side of him at the little town that he was leaving. The town was ghostly and dim in the morning darkness. The fronts of the buildings were grey shapes that rose out of the earth like huge eroded stones, and the half-dugouts appeared to be piles of rubble thrown carelessly about open holes. The procession passed Jackson's saloon, and soon it was past the town. In the flat country beyond the town, it seemed to be darker. The clopping of the horses' hooves became dull and regular in the ears of the men, and the thin clogging odor of dust clung about their nostrils, and was not blown away in the slowness of their passage. Beyond the town, the procession passed on its left MacDonald's small shack and the pole-fenced brining pits. Miller turned his head, grunting something inaudible to himself, and chuckled. A little past the clump of cottonwood trees, where the road began to go upward over the mounded banks of the stream, the 3 men on horseback came to a pause, and the wagon behind them creaked to a halt. They turned and looked back, widening their eyes against the darkness. As they looked at the vague, sprawling shape of Butcher's Crossing, a dim yellow light, disembodied and hanging casually in the darkness, came on. From somewhere a horse neighed and snorted. With one accord they turned again on their horses and began to descend the road that led across the river. Where they crossed, the river was shallow. Its trickling around the flat rocks that had been laid in the soft mud as a bed for crossing had a murmurous sound that was intensified by the darkness. The dim light from the filling moon caught irregularly upon the water as it flowed, and there was visible upon the stream a constant glitter that made it appear wider and deeper than it was. The water barely came above the horses' hooves and flowed unevenly over the turning rims of the wagon wheels. A few moments after they crossed the stream, Miller again pulled his horse to a halt. In the dimness, the other men could see him raise himself in the saddle and lean toward the lifting darkness in the west. As if it were heavy, He lifted his arm and pointed in that direction. "We'll cut across the country here," he said, "and hit the Smoky Trail about noon." The first pink streaks of light were beginning to show in the east. The group turned off the road and set across the flat land. In a few minutes the narrow road was no longer visible to them. Will Andrews turned in his saddle and looked back. He could not be sure of the point where they had left the road, and he could see no mark to guide them in their journey westward. The wagon wheels went easily and smoothly through the thick yellow-green grass. The wagon left narrow parallel lines behind it, which were quickly swallowed up in the level distance. The sun rose behind them, and they went more quickly forward, as if pushed by the increasing heat. The air was clear, and the sky was without clouds. The sun beat against their backs and brought sweat through their rough clothing. Once the group passed a small hut with a sod roof. The hut was set on the open plain. Behind it, a small plot of ground had been cleared once, but now it was going back to the yellow-green grass that covered the land. A broken wagon wheel lay near the front entrance, and a heavy wooden plough was rotting beside it. Through the wide door, at the side of which hung a scrap of weathered canvas, they could see an overturned table and the floor covered with dust and rubble. Miller turned in his saddle and spoke to Andrews. "Gave it up." His voice had a thin edge of satisfaction. "Lots of them have tried it, but don't many make it. They pull out when it gets a little bad." Andrews nodded, but he did not speak. As they went past the hut, his head turned. He watched the place until his view of it was cut off by the wagon that came behind them. By noon, the horses' hides were shining with sweat, and white flecks of foam covered their mouths and were sent flying into the air as they shook their heads against the bits. The heat throbbed against Andrew's body, and his head pounded painfully with the beat of his pulse. Already the flesh on his upper thighs was tender from rubbing against the saddle flaps, and his buttocks were numb on the hard leather of the seat. Never before had he ridden for more than a few hours at a time. He winced at the thought of the pain he would feel at the end of the day. Schneider's voice broke upon him. "We ought to be getting to the river about this time. I don't see no sign of it yet." His voice was directed to no one in particular, but Miller turned and answered him shortly. "It ain't far. The animals can hold out till we get there." Hardly had he finished speaking when Charlie Hodge, behind them in the wagon, perched higher on his wagon seat than they in their saddles, called in his high voice, "Look ahead! You can see the trees from here." Andrew squinted and strained his eyes against the noon brightness. After a few moments he was able to make out a thin dark line that slashed up through the yellow field. Miller turned to Schneider. "Shouldn't be more than 10 minutes from here," he said, and smiled a little. "Think you can hold out?" Schneider shrugged. "I ain't in no hurry. I was just wondering if we was going to find it as easy as you thought." Miller wrapped his horse gently across the rump with one hand, and the horse went forward a bit more rapidly. Behind him, Andrews heard the sharp crack of Charlie Hodge's whip and heard his wordless cry to the oxen. He turned. The oxen lumbered forward more swiftly, as if they had been awakened from a reverie. A light breeze came toward them, ruffling the grass in a soft sweep. The horse's ears pitched forward. Beneath him, Andrews felt a sudden stiffening and a surge of movement as his horse went ahead. Miller pulled back on his reins and called to Andrews. "Hold him hard. They smell water. If you ain't careful, he'll run away with you." Andrews grasped the reins tightly and pulled hard against the forward movement of the horse. The horse's head came back, the black eyes wide and the coarse black mane flying. He heard behind him the thin squeak of leather straining as Charlie Hodge braked against the oxen, and heard the oxen lowing as if in agony at their restraint. By the time they got to the smoky hill, the animals were quieter, but tense and impatient. Andrew's hands were sore from pulling against the reins. He dismounted. Hardly had he got his feet on the ground when his horse sprang away from him and tore through the low underbrush that lined the river. His legs were weak. He took a few steps forward and sat shakily in the shade of a scrub oak. The branches scratched against his back, but he did not have the will to move. He watched dully as Charlie Hodge set the brake on the wagon and unyoked the first team of oxen from the heavy single tree. With his one hand pulling hard against the yoke, his body slanted between the oxen, Charlie Hodge let himself be pulled toward the stream. He returned in a few moments and led another pair to the stream, while the remaining oxen set up a deep and mindless lowing. Miller dropped upon the ground beside Andrews. Schneider sat across from them, his back to another tree, and looked about indifferently. Charlie has to lead them down 2 at a time, yoked together, Miller said. If he let 'em all go down together, they might trample each other. They ain't got much more sense than buffalo. By the time the last oxen were released from the wagon, the horses began to amble back from the river. The men removed the bits from their horses' mouths and let them graze. Charlie got some dried fruit and biscuits from the wagon, and the men munched on them. Might as well take it easy for a while, Miller said. The stock will have to graze, so we can take it easy for a couple of hours. Small black flies buzzed about their damp faces, and their hands were busy slapping them away. The slow gurgle of the river, hidden by the dense brush, came to their ears. Schneider lay on his back and placed a dirty red handkerchief over his face and folded his bare hands under his armpits. Soon he was asleep, and the center of the red handkerchief rose and fell gently with his breathing. Charlie Hodge wandered along the grassy outer bank of the river toward the grazing animals. "How far have we come this morning?" Andrews asked Miller, who sat erect beside him. "Pretty near 8 miles, Miller answered. "We'll do better when the team is broke in. They ain't working together like they ought to." There was a silence. Miller continued, "A mile or so ahead, we run into the Smoky Hill Trail. It follows the river pretty close all the way into the Colorado territory. It's easy traveling. Should take us less than a week." "And when we get into the Colorado?" Andrews asked. Miller grinned briefly and shook his head. "No trail there. We'll just travel on the country." Andrews nodded. The weakness in his body had given way to a lassitude. He stretched his limbs and lay on his stomach, his chin resting on his folded hands. The short grass, green under the trees and moist from the seepage of the river, tickled his nostrils. He smelled the damp earth and the sweet, sharp freshness of the grass. He did not sleep, but his eyes drooped and his breath came evenly and deeply. He thought of the short distance they had come, and he tensed muscles that were growing sore. It was only the beginning of the journey. What he had seen this morning, the flatness, the emptiness, the yellow sea of undisturbed grass, was only the presentiment of the wilderness. Another strangeness was waiting for him when they left the trail and went into the Colorado territory. His half-closed eyes nearly recaptured the sharp engravings he had seen in books, in magazines, when he was at home in Boston. But the thin black lines wavered upon the real grass before him, took on color, then faded. He could not recapture the strange sensations he had had long ago, when he first saw those depictions of the land he now was seeking. Among the 3 men who waited beside the river, the silence was not broken until Charlie Hodge began leading the oxen back to the wagon to yoke them for the resumption of the afternoon trip. The trail upon which they went was a narrow strip of earth that had been worn bare by wagon wheels and hooves. Occasionally deep ruts forced the wagon off into the tall grass, where the land was often more level than on the trail. Andrews asked Miller why they stuck to the trail, and Miller explained that the sharp grass, whipping all day against the hooves and fetlocks of an ox, could make him footsore. For the horses, which lifted their hooves higher even in a slow walk, there was less danger. Once, along the trail, they came upon a wide strip of bare earth that intersected their path. In this strip, the earth was packed tightly down, though its surface was curiously pocked with regular indentations. It extended away from the river almost as far as the eye could see, and gradually merged into the prairie grass. On the other side of the men, it led toward the river, gradually increasing in width to the very edge of the river, which at this point was bare of brush and tree. "Buffalo," Miller said. "This is their watering place. They come across here," he pointed to the plain, "in a straight line and spread out at the river. No reason for it. I've seen 1,000 buffalo lined up in ruts like this, one behind the other, waiting for the water." Along the trail, they saw no other signs of the buffalo that day, though Miller remarked that they were getting into buffalo country. The sun whitened the western sky and threw its heat against their movement. Their horses bowed their heads and stumbled on the flat land, their sleek coats shining with sweat. The oxen plodded before the wagon, their breathing heavy and labored. Andrews pulled his hat down to shade his face and bent his head so that he saw only the horse's curved black mane, the dark brown pommel of his saddle, and the yellow land moving jerkily beneath him. He was soaked with sweat, and the flesh of his thighs and buttocks was raw from its chafing against the saddle. He shifted his position until the shifting offered him no relief, and then he tethered his horse on the tailgate of the wagon and clambered upon the spring seat beside Charlie Hoge. But the hard wood of the seat pained him more than the saddle, and the dust from the oxen's hooves choked him and made his eyes burn. He had to sit rigid and tense upon the narrow board to hold himself erect against the slow swaying of the wagon. Soon, with a few words to Charlie Hoge, who had not spoken to him, he got off the wagon and once again resumed his shifting position in his saddle. For the rest of the afternoon he rode in a kind of pain that approached numbness, but never achieved it. When the sun descended beyond the vast curve of the horizon, reddening the sky and the land, the animals lifted their heads and went forward more swiftly. Miller, who had ridden all day ahead of the party, turned and shouted to Charlie Hoge, "Whip them up. They can stand it now the day is turned cool. We need to make another 5 miles before we set camp." For the first time since early in the morning, the sharp crack of Charlie Hoge's whip sounded above the creaking of the wagon and the thud of the oxen's hooves. The men stirred their horses to a fast walk that occasionally broke into a slow, jarring trot. After the sun went down, the darkness came swiftly, and still the group moved forward. The moon rose thinly behind them. It seemed to Andrews that their motion carried them nowhere, that they were agitated painfully upon a small, dim plateau that moved beneath them as they had the illusion of going forward. In the near darkness, he grasped the horn of his saddle and raised himself up by pressing his unsteady feet upon the stirrups. About 2 hours later, Miller, a vague shape that seemed a part of the animal he rode, halted and shouted back to them in a voice clear and sharp in the darkness. "Pull her up at that clump of willows, Charlie. We camp here." Andrews went cautiously toward Miller, holding his reins tightly against the movement of his horse. Dark against the lesser darkness, the brush of the riverbank sprang up before him. He tried to remove one foot from a stirrup to dismount, but his leg was so stiff and numb that he was unable to do so. Finally, he reached down and grasped the stirrup by its strap and tugged until he could feel the stirrup swing free. Then he threw the weight of his body to one side and half fell from his horse. He supported himself for a few moments on the ground by holding hard to his saddle. "Rough day." The voice was low but close to his ear. He turned. Miller's broad white face hung in the darkness. Andrews swallowed and nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "It takes some getting used to," Miller said. "A couple days riding, then you'll be all right." He untied Andrew's bedroll from behind his saddle and gave the horse a heavy slap on the rump. "We'll bed down in that little draw on the other side of the willows. Think you can manage now?" Andrews nodded and took the bedroll from him. "Thanks," he said. "I'm all right." He walked unsteadily in the direction that Miller had indicated, though he could see nothing beyond the dark clump of the willow. Dim shapes moved around him, and he realized that Charlie Hoge had already unyoked the oxen, and they were crashing their way to the river. He heard the sound of a shovel pushing into earth and grating on rock, and saw the glint of moonlight on the blade as it was turned. He went nearer. Charlie Hoge was digging a small pit. With his good hand he held the handle of the shovel, while with one foot he thrust the blade into the ground. Then, bending over, he cradled the handle in the bend of his other arm and levered the shovel up, spilling the earth beside the pit he was digging. Andrews dropped his bedroll to the ground and sat upon it, his arms thrust between his legs, his fingers curled loosely on the ground. After a few moments, Charlie Hodge stopped his digging and went away into the darkness, returning with a bundle of twigs and small branches. He dropped them into the pit and struck a match, which flamed fretfully in the darkness, and thrust the match among the small twigs. Soon the fire was burning brightly, leaping up into the darkness. Not until then did Andrews notice Schneider lounging across from him on the other side of the fire. Schneider grinned at him once, sardonically, his face flickering in the flame light. Then he lay back on his bedroll and pulled his hat over his face. For the next hour or two, in his exhaustion, Andrews was only vaguely aware of what had happened around him. Charlie Hodge came in and out of his sight, feeding the fire. Miller came up near him, spread out his bedroll, and lay upon it, his gaze directed at the fire. Andrews dozed. He came awake with a start at the aroma of brewing coffee, and looked about him with a sudden bewilderment. For a moment all he could see was the small glowing patch of coals in front of him, which sent an intense heat against his face and arms. Then he was aware of the bulky figures of Schneider and Miller standing near the pit. Painfully he raised himself from the bedroll and joined them. In silence the men drank their coffee and ate the scalding beans and side pork that Charlie Hodge had prepared. Andrews found himself eating wolfishly, in great gulps, though he was not aware of any hunger. The men scraped the large pot clean of the food, and sopped the liquid in their tin plates with crumbs of dried biscuit. They drained the blackened coffee pot to the dregs, and sat on their bedrolls with their hot coffee, sipping slowly, while Charlie Hodge carried the utensils down to the river. Without removing his shoes, Andrews folded his bedroll over him and lay on the ground. Mosquitoes buzzed about his face, but he did not brush them away. Just before he went to sleep, he heard in the distance the sound of horses' hooves and the faint squeal of rapidly turning wagon wheels. The far sound of a man's voice shouting indistinguishable words rose above the other noises. Andrews lifted himself on an elbow. Miller's voice came to him very close, out of the darkness. Buffalo hunters, probably one of MacDonald's outfits. His voice was edged with contempt. They're going too fast. Can't have many hides. The sounds faded into the distance. For a while Andrews remained on his elbow, his eyes straining in the direction that the sounds had come from. Then his arm tired, and he lay down and slept almost immediately. 2. The great plain swayed beneath them as they went steadily westward. The rich buffalo grass, upon which their animals fattened even during the arduous journey, changed its color throughout the day. In the morning, in the pinkish rays of the early sun, it was nearly gray. Later, in the yellow light of the mid-morning sun, it was a brilliant green. At noon, it took on a bluish cast. In the afternoon, in the intensity of the sun, at a distance, the blades lost their individual character, and through the green showed a distinct cast of yellow, so that when a light breeze whipped across, a living color seemed to run through the grass, to disappear and reappear from moment to moment. In the evening, after the sun had gone down, the grass took on a purplish hue as if it absorbed all the light from the sky and would not give it back. After their first day's journey, the country lost some of its flatness. It rolled out gently before them, and they traveled from soft hollow to soft rise, as if they were tiny chips blown upon the frozen surface of a great sea. Upon the surface of this sea, among the slow hollows and crests, Will Andrews found himself less and less conscious of any movement forward. During the first few days of the journey, he had been so torn with the raw agony of movement that each forward step his mount took cut itself upon his nerves and upon his mind. But the pain dulled after the first days, and a kind of numbness took its place. He felt no sensation of his buttocks upon the saddle, and his legs might have been of wood, so stiffly and without feeling did they set about the sides of his horse. It was during this numbness that he lost the awareness of any progression forward. The horse beneath him took him from hollow to crest, yet it seemed to him that the land rather than the horse moved beneath him like a great treadmill, revealing in its movement only another part of itself. Day by day, the numbness crept upon him, until at last the numbness seemed to be himself. He felt himself to be like the land, without identity or shape. Sometimes one of the men who would look at him, look through him, as if he did not exist. And he had to shake his head sharply and move an arm or a leg and glance at it to assure himself that he was visible. And the numbness extended to his perception of the others who rode with him on the empty plain. Sometimes in his weariness he looked at them without recognition, seeing but the crudest shapes of men. At such times he knew them only by the positions they occupied. As at the beginning of the journey, Miller rode ahead, and Andrews and Schneider formed the base of a triangle behind him. Often as the group approached out of a hollow a slight rise of land, Miller, no longer outlined against the horizon, seemed to merge into the earth, a figure that accommodated itself to the colour and contour of the land upon which it rode. After the first day's journey, Miller spoke very little, as if hardly aware of the men who rode with him. Like an animal, he sniffed at the land, turning his head this way and that at sounds or scents unperceived by the others. Sometimes he lifted his head in the air and did not move for long moments, as if waiting for a sign that did not come. Beside Andrews, but across from him by 30 feet or more, rode Schneider, his broad hat pulled low over his eyes, and his stiff hair bristling beneath his hat like a bundle of weathered straw. He slumped in his saddle. Sometimes his eyes would close, and he swayed in the saddle, dozing. At other times, awake, he stared sullenly at a spot between his horse's ears. Occasionally he took a chew of tobacco from a square black plug that he kept in his breast pocket, and spat contemptuously at the ground, as if at something that had offended him. Seldom did he look at any of the others, and he did not speak unless it was necessary. Behind the men on horses, Charlie Hoge rode high on the clip seat of the wagon, covered by the light dust that the horses and the oxen lifted, and through which he passed. Charlie Hoge held his head erect, his eyes raised above the oxen and the men before him. Sometimes he called out to them in a thin, mocking, cheerful voice. Sometimes he hummed tunelessly to himself, keeping time with the stump of his right wrist. And sometimes his toneless voice cracked into a quavering hymn that jarred the hearing of all three men, who turned and looked back upon Charlie Hoge's oblivious, contorted face with the open mouth and squinted eyes that saw none of them. At night, after the men were fed and the animals hobbled, Charlie Hoge would open his worn and filthy Bible and mouth silently to himself by the dying light of the campfire. On their fourth day out at Butcher's Crossing, for the second time Andrews saw the sign of buffalo. It was Miller who made him see it. The group had come out of one of the interminable hollows that rolled through the Kansas plains. Miller, on top of the small rise, halted his horse and beckoned. Andrews rode up beside him. "Look out yonder," Miller said, and lifted his arm. Andrews followed the direction that Miller indicated. At first he could see only the rolling land that he had seen before. Then, in the distance, his gaze settled upon a patch of white that gleamed in the late morning sun. At the distance from which he regarded it, the patch had no shape, and barely had the substance to make itself visible in the blue-green grass that surrounded it. He turned back to Miller. "What is it?" he asked. Miller grinned. "Let's ride over and take a closer look." They let their horses go in an easy lope across the ground. Schneider came more slowly behind them, while Charlie Hoge turned the ox team slightly so that he followed, far behind them, in the same direction. As they drew nearer to the spot Miller had indicated, Andrews began to see that it was more than a patch of white. Whatever it was spread over a relatively large area of ground, as if strewn there carelessly by a huge, inhuman hand. Near the area, Miller pulled his horse up abruptly and dismounted, winding the reins around the saddle horn so that the horse's neck was arched downward. Andrews did the same, and walked up beside Miller, who stood unmoving, looking out over the scattered area. "What is it?" Andrews asked again. "Bones," Miller said, and grinned at him once more. "Buffalo bones." They walked closer. In the short prairie grass, the bones gleamed whitely, half submerged in the blue-green grass, which had grown up around them. Andrews walked among the bones, careful not to disturb them, peering curiously as he passed. "Small kill," Miller said. "Must not have been more than 30 or 40. Fairly recent, too. Look here." Andrews went to him. Miller stood before a skeleton that was almost intact. From the curving notched spine, which showed upon its top regular indentations of a greyish colour, depended the broad-bowed blades of the rib cage. The rib bones were very broad and sweeping at the front, but nearer the flanks of the animal they sharply decreased in breadth and length. Near the flank, the ribs were only nubs of white held to the spinal column by dried cords of sinew and gristle. Two broad flanges of bone at the end of the spine nestled in the grass. Trailing behind these flanges, flat in the grass, were the two wide and sharply tapering bones of the rear legs. Andrews walked around the skeleton, which lay upright on what had once been its belly, peering closely at it, but he did not touch it. "Look here," Miller said again. He pointed to the skull, which lay directly before the open oval front of the rib cage. The skull was narrow and flat, curiously small before the huge skeleton, which, at its largest point, reached slightly higher than Andrew's waist. Two short horns curved up from the skull, and a wisp of dried fur clung to the flat top of the skull. "This carcass ain't more than 2 years old," Miller said. "It's still got a stink to it." Andrews sniffed. There was a faint, rank odor of dried and crumbling flesh. He nodded and did not speak. "This here fellow was a big one," Miller said. "Must have been near 2,000 pound. You don't see them around here that big very often." Andrews tried to visualize the animal from the remains that rested stilly on the prairie grass. He called to his memory the engravings that he had seen in books, but that uncertain memory and the real bones would not merge. He could not imagine the animal as it had been. Miller kicked at one of the broad ribs. It snapped from the spine and fell softly in the grass. He looked at Andrews and moved his arm in a broad gesture to the country around them. "There was a time, in the days of the big kills, when you could look a mile in any direction and see the bones piled up. 5, 6 years ago, we'd have been riding through bones from Pawnee Fork clean to the end of the Smoky Hill. This is what the Kansas hunt has come to." He kicked again, contemptuously, at another rib. "And these won't be here long. Some dirt farmer will run across these and load them in a wagon and cart them off for fertilizer, though there ain't enough here to hardly bother with." "Fertilizer?" Andrews asked. Miller nodded. "A buffalo's a curious critter. There ain't a part of him you can't use for something." He walked the length of the skeleton, bent, and picked up the broad bone of a hind leg. He swung it in the air as if it were a club. "The Indians use these bones for everything from needles to war clubs, knives so sharp they could split you wide open. They glue pieces of the bone together with pieces of horn for their bows, and use another piece whittled down for an arrowhead. I've seen necklaces carved so pretty out of little pieces of this. You'd think they was made in St. Louis. Toys for the little ones, combs for the squaw's hair, all out of this here bone. Fertilizer." He shook his head and swung the bone again, flung it away from him. It sailed high in the air, catching the sun. It fell in the soft grass, bounced once, and was still. Behind them, a horse snorted. Schneider had ridden up near them. "Let's get going," he said. "We'll see plenty of bones before we're through with this trip. Leastways, if there's the kind of herd up in them mountains that there's supposed to be." "Sure," Miller said. "This is just a little pile anyway." The wagon came near them. In the hot noon air, Charlie Hodge's voice raised quaveringly. He sang that God was his strong salvation, that he feared no foe, nor darkness, nor temptation. He stood firm in the fight, with God at his right hand. For a moment the three men listened to the tortured voice urging its message upon the empty land. Then they pushed their horses before the wagon and resumed their slow course across the country. The signs of the buffalo became more frequent. Several times they passed over packed trails left by great herds that went down to the river for water, and once they came upon a huge saucer-like depression, nearly 6 feet in depth at its deepest point and over 40 feet across. Grass grew to the very edge of this shallow pit, but in the pit itself the earth had been worked to a fine dust. This, Miller explained to Andrews, was a buffalo wallow, where the great beasts found relief from the insects and lice that plagued them by rolling about in the dust. No buffalo had been there for a long time. Miller pointed out that there were no buffalo chips about, and that the grass around the pit was green and uncropped. Once they saw the dead body of a buffalo cow. It lay stiffly on its side in the thick green grass. Its belly was distended, and a foul stench of decaying flesh spread from it. At the approach of the men, 2 vultures that had been tearing at the flesh rose slowly and awkwardly into the air and circled high above their carrion. Miller and Andrews rode near the carcass and dismounted. Upon the still, awkward shape, the fur was a dull umber ruffed to black in spots. Andrews started to go nearer, but the stench halted him. His stomach tightened. He pulled back and circled the beast so that the wind carried the full force of the odor away from him. Miller grinned at him. "Kinda strong, ain't it?" Still grinning, he went past Andrews and squatted down beside the buffalo, examining it carefully. "Just a little cow," he said. "Whoever shot her missed the lights. More than likely, this one just plain bled to death. Probably left behind by the main herd." He kicked at the stiff, extended lower leg. The flesh thudded dully, and there was a light ripping sound as if a piece of stiff cloth had been torn. "Ain't been dead more than a week. It's a wonder there's any meat left." He shook his head, turned, and walked back to his horse, which had shied away from the odor. When Miller approached, the horse's ears flattened, and it leaned backward away from him, but Miller spoke soothingly, and the horse stilled, though the muscles around its forelegs were tense and trembling. Miller and Andrews mounted and rode past the wagon, and past Schneider, who had taken no notice of their stopping. The odor of the rotting buffalo clung in Miller's clothes, and even after he had gone ahead of Andrews, occasionally a light breeze would bring the odor back and cause Andrews to pull his hand across his nostrils and his mouth, as if something unclean had touched them. Once, also, they saw a small herd, and again it was Miller who pointed it out to Andrews. The herd was little more than clustered specks of blackness in the light green of the prairie. Andrews could make out no shape or movement, though he strained his eyes against the bright afternoon sun and raised himself high in the saddle. "It's just a little herd," Miller said. "The hunters around here have cut them all up into little herds." The 3 of them, Andrews, Miller, and Schneider, were riding abreast. Schneider said impartially, to no one, "A body has sometimes got to be satisfied with a little herd. If that's the way they run, that's the way a body has got to cut them." Miller, his eyes still straining at the distant herd, said, "I can recollect the day when you never saw a herd less than 1,000 head, and even that was just a little bunch." He swept his arm in a wide half-circle. "I've stood at a place like this and looked out, and all I could see was black, 50, 75, 100,000 head of buffalo moving over the grass, packed so tight you could walk on their backs, walk all day, and never touch the ground. Now all you see is stragglers like them out there, and grown men hunt for them." He spat on the ground. Again Schneider addressed the air. "If all you got is stragglers, then you hunt for stragglers. I ain't got my hopes up any longer for much more." "Where we're going," Miller said, "you'll see them like we used to in the old days." "Maybe so," Schneider said, "but I ain't got my hopes up too high." From the wagon behind them came the high crackle of Charlie Hodge's voice. "Just a little bitty herd. You never saw nothing that little in the old days. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away." At the sound of Charlie Hodge's voice, the 3 men had turned. They listened him out. When he finished, they turned again, but they could no longer find the tiny smudge of black in the expanse of the prairie. Miller went on ahead, and Schneider and Andrews dropped back. None of them spoke again of what they had seen. Such interruptions of their journey were few. Twice on the trail, they passed small parties going in their direction. One of these parties consisted of a man, his wife, and 3 small children. Grimed with dust, their faces drawn and sullen with weariness, the woman and children huddled in a small wagon pulled by 4 mules and did not speak. The man, eager to talk and almost breathless in his eagerness, informed them that he had driven all the way from Ohio, where he had lost his farm, and that he planned to join a brother who had a small business in California. He had begun the journey with a group of other wagons, but the lameness of one of his mules had so slowed his progress that he was now nearly 2 weeks behind the main party, and he had little hope of ever catching up. Miller examined the lame mule and advised the man to swing up to Fort Wallace, where he could rest his team and wait for another wagon train to come through. The man hesitated, and Miller told him curtly that the mule could not make it farther than Fort Wallace, and that he was a fool to continue on the trail alone. The man shook his head stubbornly. Miller said nothing more. He motioned to Andrews and Schneider, and the party pulled around the man and woman and the children and went ahead. Late in the evening, the dust from the small mule-drawn wagon could be seen in the distance, far behind them. Miller shook his head. "They'll never make it. That mule ain't good for 2 more days." He spat on the ground. "They should have turned off where I told them." The other party they passed was a larger one of 5 men on horseback. These men were silent and suspicious. Reluctantly, they informed Miller that they were on their way to Colorado, where they had an interest in an undeveloped mining claim, which they intended to work. They refused Charlie Hoge's invitation to join them for supper, and they waited in a group for Miller's party to pass. Late that night, after Miller, Andrews, Schneider, and Hoge had bedded down, they heard the muffled clop of hooves circling around and passing them. Once, where the trail skirted close to the river, they came upon a wide bluff, from the side of which had been excavated a series of crude dugouts. On the flat, hard earth in front of the dugout, several brown, naked children were playing. Behind the children, near the openings of the dugouts, squatted 6 Indians. The women were shapeless in the blankets they held about them despite the heat, and the men were old and wizened. As the group passed, the children ceased their play and looked at them with dark, liquid eyes. Miller waved, but none of the Indians gave any sign of response. "River Indians," Miller said contemptuously. "They live on catfish and jackrabbits. They ain't worth shooting anymore." But as their journey progressed, such interruptions came to seem more and more unreal to Andrews. The reality of their journey lay in the routine detail of bedding down at night, arising in the morning, drinking black coffee from hot tin cups, packing bedrolls upon gradually wearying horses, the monotonous and numbing movement over the prairie that never changed its aspect, the watering of the horses and oxen at noon, the eating of hard biscuit and dried fruit, the resumption of the journey, the fumbling setting up of camp in the darkness, the tasteless quantities of beans and bacon gulped savagely in the flickering darkness, the coffee again, and the bedding down. This came to be a ritual, more and more meaningless as it was repeated, but a ritual which nevertheless gave his life the only shape it now had. It seemed to him that he moved forward laboriously, inch by inch, over the space of the vast prairie. But it seemed that he did not move through time at all, that rather time moved with him, an invisible cloud that hovered about him and clung to him as he went forward. The passing of time showed itself in the faces of the 3 men who rode with him, and in the changes he perceived within them. Day by day he felt the skin of his face hardening in the weather. The stubble of hair on the lower part of his face became smooth as his skin roughened, and the backs of his hands reddened and then browned and darkened in the sun. He felt a leanness and a hardness creep upon his body. He thought at times that he was moving into a new body, or into a real body that lay hidden beneath layers of unreal softness and whiteness and smoothness. The change that he saw in the others was less meaningful to him, and less extreme. Miller's heavy, evenly shaped beard thickened on his face and began to curl at the extreme ends. But the change was more readily apparent in the way he sat his saddle, in his stride upon the ground, and in the look of his eyes that gazed on the opening prairie. An ease, a familiarity, and naturalness began to replace the stiff and formal attitude that Andrews had first encountered in Butcher's Crossing. He sat his saddle as if he were a natural extension of the animal he rode. He walked in such a way that it appeared his very movement was caressing the contours of the ground, and his gaze upon the prairie seemed to Andrews as open and free and limitless as the land that occasioned his regard. Schneider's face seemed to recede and hide in the slowly growing beard that bristled like straw upon his darkening skin. Day by day, Schneider withdrew into himself. He spoke to the others less frequently, and in his writing he appeared to be almost attempting to disassociate himself from them. He looked always in a direction that was away from them, and at night he ate his food silently, turned sideways from the campfire, and bedded down and was asleep long before the others. Of them all, Charlie Hode showed the least change. His grey beard bristled a bit more fully, and his skin reddened, but did not brown in the weather. He looked about him impartially, slyly, and spoke abruptly and without cause to all of them, expecting no answer. When the trail was level, he took out his worn and tattered Bible and thumbed through its pages, his weak grey eyes squinting through the dust. At regular intervals throughout the day, he reached beneath the wagon seat and drew out a loosely corked bottle of whiskey. He pulled the cork out with his yellowed teeth, dropped it into his lap, and took long, noisy swallows. Then, in his high, thin, quavering voice, he sang a hymn that floated faintly through the dust and died in the ears of the 3 men who rode before him. On the 6th day of their traveling, they came to the end of the Smoky Hill Trail. Three. The dark green line of trees and brush that they had followed all the way from Butcher's Crossing turned in a slow curve to the south. The 4 men, who came upon the turning in the mid-morning of their 6th day of journey, halted and gazed for some moments at the course of the Smoky Hill River. From where they halted, the land dropped off so that in the distance, through the brush and trees of the banks, they could see the slow-moving water. In the distance it lost its muddy green hue. The sunlight silvered its surface, and it appeared to them clear and cool. The 3 men brought their horses close together. The oxen turned their heads toward the river and moaned softly. Charlie Hode called them to a halt and set the brake handle of the wagon. He jumped off the spring seat, clambered from the wagon, and walked briskly over to where the others waited. He looked up at Miller. "Trail turns here with the river," Miller said. "Follows it all the way up to the Arkansas. We could follow it and be sure of plenty of water, but it would put us near a week off getting where we're aiming at." Schneider looked at Miller and grinned. His teeth were white in his dust-encrusted face. "I take it you don't aim to go by the trail." "It'd put us a week off, maybe more," Miller said. "I've gone across this country before." He waved toward a flat country in the west that lay beyond the Smoky Hill Trail. "There's water there for a body that knows where it is." Schneider, still grinning, turned to Andrews. "Mr. Andrews, you don't look like you ever been thirsty in your life. Real thirsty, I mean. So I guess it won't do much good to ask you what you want to do." Andrews hesitated, then he shook his head. "I have no right to speak. I don't know the country." "And Miller does," Schneider said. "Or at least that's what he tells us. So we go where Miller says." Miller smiled and nodded. "Fred, you sound like you want an extra week's pay. You ain't afraid of a little dry stretch, are you?" "I've had dry stretches before," Schneider said. "But I never have got over feeling put out when I saw horses and bullocks being watered, and me with a dry throat." Miller's smile widened. "Takes the grit out of a man," he said. "It's happened to me. But there's water less than a day from here. I don't think you'll come to that." "Just one more thing," Schneider said. "How long did you say it's been since you went over this bit of land?" "A few years," Miller said. "But some things don't leave a man." Though the smile remained on his face, his voice stiffened. "You don't have no serious complaints yet, do you, Fred?" "No," Schneider said. "I just thought there was a few things I ought to say. I said I'd go along with you back at Butcher's Crossing, and I'll go along with you now. It don't matter to me one way or another." Miller nodded and turned to Charlie Hode. "Reckon we'd better rest the stock and water them up good before we go on. And we'd better carry along as much water as we can just in case. You take care of the team, and we'll get what water we can back up to the wagon." While Charlie Hode led the oxen down to the river, the others went to the wagon and found what containers they could for carrying water. From a broad square of canvas that covered their provisions, Miller fashioned a crude barrel, held open and upright by slender green saplings that he cut at the river bank. 2 of the more slender saplings he tied together and bent into a circle, and tied again. This he attached near the four corners of the square canvas with leather thongs. The shorter and stubbier saplings he cut to a length, notched, and attached to the circled saplings, thus forming a receptacle some 5 feet in diameter and 4 feet in height. With buckets and kettles that Charlie Hoge used for cooking, and with one small wooden keg, the 3 men filled the canvas barrel 3/4 full. It took them the better part of an hour to do so. "That's enough," Miller said. "If we put any more in, it would just slosh out." They rested in the shade beside the smoky hill, while the hobbled oxen wandered along the banks, grazing on the rich grass that grew in the moisture. Because of the intense heat, and because of the dry country over which they would be traveling, Miller told them, they would begin their second drive somewhat later. So Charlie Hoge had time to cook up some soaked beans, sour belly, and coffee. Until the afternoon sun pushed the shade beyond them, they lay wearily on the grassy bank of the river, listening to the rustle of the water that flowed past them smoothly, coolly, effortlessly, that flowed back through the prairie through which they had worked their way, past Butcher's Crossing, and onward to the east. When the sun touched his face, Andrew sat up. Miller said, "Might as well get started." Charlie Hoge gathered his oxen, yoked them in pairs, and put them to the wagon. The party turned to the flat land upon which they could see neither tree nor trail to guide them, and went forward upon it. Soon the line of green that marked the Smoky Hill River was lost to them, and in the flat, unbroken land, Andrews had to keep his eyes firmly fixed on Miller's back to find any direction to go in. Twilight came upon them. Had it not been for his tiredness, and the awkward shambling weariness of the horses beneath the weight they carried forward, Andrews might have thought that the night came on and held them where they started, back at the bend of the Smoky Hill. During the afternoon's drive, he had seen no break in the flat country, neither tree nor gully, nor rise in the land that might serve as a landmark to show Miller the way he went. They camped that night without water. Few words were exchanged as they broke the packs from their horses and set up the night's camp on the open prairie. Charlie Hoge led the oxen one by one to the back of the wagon. Miller held the large canvas receptacle erect while the oxen drank. By the light of a lantern he kept careful watch on the level of water. When an ox had drunk its quota, Miller would say sharply, "That's enough," and kick at the beast as Charlie Hoge tugged its head away. When the oxen and the horses had drunk, the tank remained 1/4 full. Much later, around the campfire, which Charlie Hoge had prepared with wood gathered at their noon stop, the men squatted and drank their coffee. Schneider, whose tight, impassive face seemed to twitch and change in the flickering firelight, said impersonally, "I never cared for a dry camp." No one spoke. Schneider continued, "I guess there's a drop or two left in the tank." "It's about 1/4 full," Miller said. Schneider nodded. "We can make one more day on that, I figure. It'll be a mite dry, but we should make one more day." Miller said, "I figure one more day." "If we don't come across some water," Schneider said. "If we don't come across some water," Miller agreed. Schneider lifted his tink up and drained the last drag of coffee from it. In the firelight, his raised chin and throat bristled and quivered. His voice was cool and lazy. "I reckon we better hit some water tomorrow." "We'd better," Miller said. Then, "There's plenty of water. It's just there for the finding." No one answered him. He went on. "I must have missed a mark somewhere. There should have been water right along here, but it's nothing serious. We'll get water tomorrow for sure." The 3 men were watching him intently. In the dying light, Miller returned each of their stares, looking at Schneider at length, coolly. After a moment he sighed and put his cup carefully on the ground in front of Charlie Hoge. "Let's get some sleep," Miller said. "I want to get an early start in the morning, before the heat sets in." Andrews tried to sleep, but despite his tiredness, he did not rest soundly. He kept being awakened by the low moaning of the oxen, which gathered at the end of the wagon, pawed the earth, and butted against the closed tailgate that protected the little store of water in the open canvas tank. Andrews was shaken from his uneasy sleep by Miller's hand on his shoulder. His eyes opened on darkness, and on the dim hulk of Miller above him. He heard the others moving about, stumbling and cursing in the early morning dark. If we can get them going soon enough, they won't miss the watering, Miller said. By the time the false light shone in the east, the oxen were yoked. The party again moved westward. Give your horses their heads, Miller told them. Let them set their own pace. We'll do better not to push any of them till we get some water. The animals moved sluggishly through the warming day. As the sun brightened, Miller rode far ahead of the main party. He sat erect in his saddle and moved his head constantly from one side to another. Occasionally he got off his horse and examined the ground closely, as if it concealed some sign that he had missed atop his horse. They continued their journey well into the middle of the day, and past it. When one of the oxen stumbled, and in getting to its feet gashed at its fellow with a blunt horn, Miller called the party to a halt. "Fill your canteens," he said. "We've got to water the stock, and there won't be any left." Silently, the men did as they were told. Schneider was the last to approach the canvas tank. He filled his canteen, drank from it in long, heavy gulps, and refilled it. Schneider helped Charlie Hoge control the oxen as, one by one, they were led to the rear of the wagon and the open tank of water. When the oxen were watered and tethered at some distance from the wagon, the horses were allowed to finish the water. After the horses had got from the tank all that they were able, Miller broke down the saplings that gave the canvas its shape, and with Charlie Hoge's help drained the water that remained in the folds of the canvas into a wooden keg. Charlie Hoge untethered the oxen and let them graze on the short yellowish grass. Then he returned to the wagon and broke out a package of dry biscuits. "Don't eat too many of them," Miller said. "They'll dry you out." The men squatted in the narrow shade cast by the wagon. Slowly and delicately, Schneider ate one of the biscuits and took a small sip of water after it. Finally, he sighed and spoke directly to Miller. "What's the story, Miller? Do you know where there's water?" Miller said, "There was a little pile of rocks a piece back, I think I remember. Another half day, and we ought to hit a stream." Schneider looked at him quizzically. Then he stiffened, took a deep breath, and asked, his voice soft, "Where are we, Miller?" "No need to worry," Miller said. "Some of the landmarks have changed since I was here, but another half day and I'll get us fixed." Schneider grinned and shook his head. He laughed softly and sat down on the ground, shaking his head. "My God," he said. "We're lost." "As long as we keep going in that direction," Miller pointed away from their shadows toward the failing sun. "We're not lost. We're bound to run into water tonight or early in the morning." "This is a big country," Schneider said. "We're not bound to do anything." "No need to worry," Miller said. Schneider looked at Andrews, still grinning. "How does it feel, Mr. Andrews? Just thinking about it makes you thirsty, don't it?" Andrews looked away from him quickly and frowned, but what he said was true. The biscuit in his mouth felt suddenly dry, like sun-beat sand. He had swallowed against the dryness. He noticed that Charlie Hoge put his half-eaten biscuit into his shirt pocket. "We can still cut south," Schneider said. "Another day, at the most, a day and a half. We'll run into the Arkansas. The stock might just hold up for a day and a half." "It would put us a week off," Miller said. "And besides, there's no cause for it. We may get a little dry, but we'll make it all right. I know this country." "Not so well you don't get lost in it," Schneider said. "I say, we turn to the Arkansas. We'll be sure of water there." He pulled up a tuft of the dry yellow grass that surrounded them. "Look at this. There's been a drought in this country. How do we know the streams ain't dried up? What if the ponds are empty?" "There's water in this country," Miller said. "Seen any sign of buffalo?" Schneider looked at each of them. "Not a sign, and you won't find buffalo where there ain't no water. I say we ought to head for the Arkansas." Miller sighed and smiled distantly at Schneider. "We'd never make it, Fred." "What?" "We'd never make it. We've been heading at an angle ever since we left the Smoky Hill. With watered stock, it would take us 2.5 days, almost as bad as going back to the Smoky Hill. Dry, this stock would never make it." "God damn it," Schneider said quietly. "You ought to have let us know." Miller said, "There's nothing to worry about. I'll get you to water, if I have to dig for it. God damn it, Schneider said. You son of a bitch. I'm half a mind to cut out on my own. I might just make it. And you might not, Miller said. Do you know this country, Fred? You know damn well I don't, Schneider said. Then you better stick with the party. Schneider looked from one of them to another. You're pretty sure the party is going to stick with you? Miller's tight face relaxed, and the loose ridges came again about the corners of his mouth. I'm going ahead, just like I've been going. I just have to get the feel of the land again. I've been watching too close, trying too hard to remember. Once I get the feel of the country again, I'll be all right, and the rest of you will be all right too. Schneider nodded. Hoge will stick with you, I guess. That right, Charlie? Charlie Hoge lifted his head abruptly, as if startled. He rubbed the stump of his wrist. I go where God wills, he said. He will lead us to where water is when we are athirst. Sure, Schneider said. He turned to Andrews. Well, that leaves us, Mr. Andrews. What do you say? It's your wagon and your team. If you say we go south, Miller would have a hard time going against you. Andrews looked at the ground. Between the dry, thin blades of grass, the earth was powdery. Though he did not look up, he felt the eyes of the others upon him. We've come this far, he said. We might as well keep on with Miller. All right, Schneider said. You're all crazy, but it looks like I've got no choice. Do whatever you want to do. Miller's thin lips lengthened in a slight smile. You worry too much, Fred. If it gets that bad, we can always get by on Charlie's whiskey. There must be 9 or 10 gallons of it left. The horses will be glad to hear that, Schneider said. I can see us walking out of here on 10 gallons of whiskey. You worry too much, Miller said. You'll live to be 105. I've had my say. I'll go along with you. Now, let me get some rest. He lay on his side, rolled under the shade of the wagon, and came to rest with his back to them. We all might as well try to get some sleep, Miller said. It won't do to travel in the heat. We'll rest ourselves and get the drive started this evening. Lying on his side, his folded arms supporting his head, Andrews looked out of the shade across the level prairie. As far as he could see, the land was flat and without identity. The blades of grass that stood up stiffly, a few inches from his nose, blurred and merged into the distance, and the distance came upon him with a rush. He closed his eyes upon what he saw, and his vague fingers pushed at the grass until they parted it, and he could feel the dry, powdery earth upon his fingertips. He pressed his body against the ground and did not look at anything, until the terror that had crept upon him from his dizzying view of the prairie passed, as if through his fingertips, back into the earth whence it had come. His mouth was dry. He started to reach for his canteen, but he did not. He forced thirst away from him and put thought from his mind. After a while, his body, tense against the earth, relaxed, and before the afternoon was over, he slept. When the edge of the sun cut into the far horizon, they resumed their journey. Night came on rapidly. In the moonlight, Miller, ahead of them, was a frenzied, hunched figure, whose body swayed this way and that in his saddle. Though Andrews and Schneider let their horses go at their own paces, Miller spurred in an erratic zigzag across the land that seemed to glow out of the night. To no apparent purpose, Miller would cut at a sharp angle from a path they took, and follow the new course for half an hour or so, only to abandon it and cut in another direction. For the first few hours, Andrews tried to keep their course in his mind, but weariness dulled his attention, and the stars in the clear sky and the thin moon whirled about his head. He closed his eyes and slumped forward in the saddle, letting his horse trail Schneider and Miller. Even in the cool of the night, thirst gnawed at him, and occasionally he took a small sip of water from his canteen. Once they paused to let the oxen graze. Andrews remained in his saddle, sleepily aware of what was going on. They traveled into the next morning, and into the heat of the day. The oxen moved slowly. They moaned almost constantly, and their breaths were dry and rasping. Even Andrews could see that their coats were growing dull, and that the bones were showing sharply along their ribs and flanks. Schneider rode up beside him and jerked his head back in the direction of the oxen. They look bad. Their tongues will start swelling next. Then they won't be able to breathe and pull at the same time. We should have headed south. With luck, we might have made it. Andrews did not answer. His throat felt unbearably dry. Despite himself, he reached behind his saddle for his canteen and took 2 long swallows of water. Schneider grinned and drew his horse away. With an effort of will, Andrews closed his canteen and replaced it behind his saddle. Shortly before noon, Miller pulled his horse to a halt, dismounted, and walked back toward the slowly moving wagon. He motioned to Charlie Hoge to stop. "We'll wait the heat out here," he said shortly. He walked into the shade of the wagon. Schneider and Andrews came up to him. "They look bad, Miller," Schneider said. He turned to Charlie Hoge. "How do they drive?" Charlie Hoge shook his head. "Their tongues are beginning to swell. They won't last out the day. And the horses. Look at them." "Never mind that," Miller said. His voice was low and toneless, almost a growl. The black pupils of his eyes were shining and blank. They were fixed upon the man without appearing to see them. "How much water's left in the canteens?" "Not much," Snyder said. "Maybe enough to get us through the night." "Get them," Miller said. "Now look," Schneider said, "if you think I'm going to use water for anything except myself, you—" "Get them," Miller said. He turned his eyes to Schneider. Schneider cursed softly, got to his feet, and returned with his own and Andrew's canteens. Miller gathered them, put his with them, and said to Charlie Hoge, "Charlie, get the keg and bring your canteen down here." Schneider said, "Now look, Miller, those oxen will never make it. No use wasting what little water we got. You can't—" "Shut up," Miller said. "Arguing about it will just make us dry. Like I said, we still have Charlie's whiskey." "My God," Schneider said. "You were serious." Charlie Hoge returned to the shade beside the wagon and handed Miller a canteen and the wooden keg. Miller set the keg carefully on the ground, rotating it a few times under the pressure of his hands so that it rested level on the stubby grass. He unscrewed the tops of the canteens one by one and carefully poured the water into the keg, letting the canteens hang above it for several minutes until the last globules of water gathered on the mouths, hung, and finally dropped. After the last canteen was emptied, about 4 inches of water was in the keg. Schneider picked up his empty canteen, looked at it carefully, and then looked at Miller. With all his strength, he flung the canteen against the side of the wagon, from where it rebounded back toward him, past him, and fell into the grass. "God damn it," he shouted. His voice was startling in the hot prairie quiet. "What good do you expect to do with that little bit of water? You're throwing it away." Miller did not look at him. He spoke to Charlie Hoge. "Charlie, unyoke the oxen and lead them around here, one at a time." While the 3 men waited, Miller and Andrews still, Schneider quivering and turning in an impotent rage, Charlie Hoge singly detached the oxen and led them around to Miller. Miller took a rag from his pocket, soaked it in the water, and squeezed it gently, holding it carefully above the keg so that no water was lost. "Fred, you and Will get a hold of his horns. Hold him steady." While Schneider and Andrews grasped each of the horns, Charlie Hoge circled the beast's bony and corded neck with his good arm, digging his heels in the ground and pulling against the forward surge of the ox. With the wet rag, Miller bathed the dry lips of the ox. Then he put the rag into the water again and squeezed it so that no water was wasted. "Pull up on the horns," he said to Schneider and Andrews. When the ox's head was up, Miller grasped the upper lip of the beast and pulled upward. The tongue, dark and swollen, quivered in its mouth. Again, with care, Miller bathed the rough, distended flesh. His hand and wrist were thrust out of sight, up into the ox's throat. Withdrawing his hand, he squeezed hard on the wet rag, and a few drops of water trickled on the tongue, which absorbed them like a dark, dry sponge. One by one, the oxen's mouths were bathed. Sweatless and hot, the 3 men held the beasts and dug their feet into the earth. Schneider cursed steadily, quietly. Andrews breathed in heavy gasps, the dry air that was rough like a burr in his throat, and tried to keep his arms from trembling loose from the smooth, hot horns of the oxen. After each ox had been treated, Charlie Hoge led it back to its yoke and returned with another. Despite the haste with which they worked, it was the better part of an hour before they finished with the last animal. Miller leaned against the side of the wagon. His dry, leather-like skin stood out from his black beard with a faint yellowish cast. "They ain't so bad," he said, breathing heavily. "They'll last to nightfall, and we still got a bit of water left." He pointed to the muddy inch or so of water that remained in the keg. Schneider laughed. It was a dry sound that turned into a cough. "A pint of water for 8 oxen and 3 horses. "It'll keep the swelling down," Miller said. "It's enough for that." Charlie Hoge returned from the front of the wagon. "Do we unyoke them now and take a rest?" "No," Miller said. "Their tongues will swell as bad standing here as they will if we keep on, and we can keep them from grazing better if we're on the move." "On the move where?" Schneider said. "How long you think them cows can pull this here wagon?" "Long enough," Miller said. "We'll find water." Schneider moved suddenly and whirled to Miller. "I just thought," he said. "How much lead and powder you got in that wagon?" "1.5 tons, 2 tons," Miller said, not looking at him. "Well, my God," Schneider said. "No wonder them animals is dry. We could go twice as far if we dumped the stuff." "No," Miller said. "We can find water and maybe come back and pick it up. It ain't as if we intended to just leave it here." "No," Miller said. "We get there like we started out, or we don't get there at all. There ain't no need to get in a panic." "You crazy son of a bitch," Schneider said. He kicked one of the heavy hickory wheel spokes. "God damn it, crazier 'n hell." He kicked the spoke again and pounded a fist on the rim of the wheel. "Besides," Miller said calmly, "it wouldn't make all that difference. On this land, a full wagon can pull almost as easy as an empty one, once the team gets started." "It's no good talking to him," Schneider said. "No good at all." He strode out of the shade and went to his horse, which had been tethered to the end of the wagon, its head held high so that it could not graze. Andrews and Miller followed him more slowly. "It does Fred good to blow off now and then," Miller said to Andrews. "He knows if we left the load here, we might be a week finding it again, if we found it at all. Looking for it might put us in as bad a shape as we are now. We don't leave a heavy enough trail to follow back, and you can't mark a trail very well in land like this." Andrews looked behind him. It was true. The wheels of the wagon in the short, stiff grass on the baked earth left hardly an impression. Even now the grass over which they had driven was springing erect to hide the evidence of their passage. Andrews tried to swallow, but the contraction of his muscles was stopped by his dry throat. Their horses moved sluggishly, and beneath Charlie Hoge's cracking whip, and before his thin, sharp voice, the oxen moved weakly against the pull of the wagon. They shambled unsteadily forward, working not as a team, but as separate beasts, struggling from the whip and the sound of the driving voice behind them. Once in the afternoon, the party came near a shallow depression in the earth, the bottom of which was cracked in an intricate pattern of dried mud. They looked sullenly at the dried-up pond and did not speak. In the middle of the afternoon, Miller forced each of them to take a short swallow of Charlie Hoge's whiskey. "Don't take too much," he warned. "Just enough to get your throat wet. More than that'll make you sick." Andrews gagged on the liquor. It seared his dry tongue and throat as if a torch had been thrust into his mouth. When he ran his tongue over his cracked, dry lips, they burned with a pain that lingered for many minutes later. He closed his eyes and clung to his saddle horn as the horse went forward, but the darkness upon his closed eyelids was shot with spears of light that whirled dizzily. He was forced to open them again and observe the trackless and empty way they went. By sundown, the oxen again were breathing with sharp, grunting moans. Their tongues were so swollen that they moved with their mouths half open. Their heads were down, swinging from side to side. Miller called the wagon to a halt. Again, Schneider and Andrews held the horns of the beasts, but even though both men were much weaker than they had been earlier, their task was easier. The oxen dumbly and without resistance let themselves be pulled around, and did not even show interest in the water with which Miller bathed their mouths. "We won't stop," Miller said. His voice was a heavy, flat croak. "Better to keep them moving while they're still on their feet." He stood the bucket on its edge and sopped up the last of the water with the rag. He bathed the mouths of the horses. When he finished, the rag was almost dry. After the sun dropped beneath the flat horizon before them, darkness came on quickly. Andrew's hands clung to the saddle horn. They were so weak that again and again they slipped from it, and he hardly had the strength to pull them back. Breathing was an effort of agony. Slumped inertly in his saddle, he learned to snuffle a little air through his nostrils and to exhale it quickly, and to wait several seconds before he repeated the process. Sometime during the night he discovered that his mouth was open and that he could not close it. His tongue pushed between his teeth, and when he tried to bring them together, a dull, dry pain spread in his mouth. He remembered the sight of the oxen's tongues, black and swollen and dry. And he pushed his mind away from that image, away from himself, and tried to push his mind into a place as dark and unbounded as the night in which he travelled. Once an oxen stumbled and would not get back upon its feet. The three men had to dismount, and with their little remaining strength pull and tug and prod the beast upright. Then the oxen would not, or could not summon strength to get the wagon into motion. So the three pushed against the wagon spokes, while Charlie Hodge's whip cracked above the oxen, until the wheels began to move and the beasts took up the forward movement in a slow shamble. Andrews tried to wet his mouth with a little of Charlie Hodge's whiskey, but most of the liquid ran off his lips down the corners of his mouth. He rode most of the night in a state that alternated between a mild delirium and intense pain. Once he came to his senses and found himself alone in the darkness. He had no sense of place, no knowledge of direction. In a panic he whirled one way and another in his saddle. He looked upward into the immense bowl of the sky and downward at the earth upon which he rode, and the one seemed as far away as the other. Then he heard faintly the creak of the wagon and prodded his horse in that direction. In a few moments he was back with the others, who had not noticed his lagging behind. Even with them, he shivered for a long while, the panic he had felt when he thought himself abandoned still upon him. For a long while the panic kept him alert, and he followed Miller's dim movements, not as if those movements might lead him where he wished to go, but as if they might save him from wandering into a nothingness where he would be alone. Shortly after dawn, they found water. Afterward, Andrews remembered, as if from a dream, the first sign they had that water was near. In the early light from the east, Miller stiffened in his saddle and raised his head like an alert animal. Then, almost imperceptibly, he pulled his horse in a slightly northerly direction, his head still raised and alert. A few moments later, he reined his horse more sharply north, so that Charlie Hodge had to dismount from the wagon and prod the oxen toward Miller's horse. Then, as the first small edge of the sun came above the flat line in the east, Andrews was aware that his horse had begun to quiver beneath him. He saw that Miller's horse, too, was straining impatiently. Its ears were pitched sharply forward, and it was held by Miller's taut reins. Miller twisted in his saddle and faced those behind him. In the soft yellow light that fell upon Miller's face, Andrews could see the cracked lips, raw and slightly bleeding, from the distended cracks, parted in a grotesque smile. "By God," Miller called. His voice was rasping and weak, but it held a deep note of triumph. "By God, we found it. Hold your horses back," and, turning still farther around, he raised his voice. "Charlie, hold on to them oxen as hard as you can. They'll smell it in a few minutes, and they're likely to go crazy." Andrew's horse bolted suddenly. Startled, he pulled back with all his strength on the reins, and the horse reared upward, its front hooves pawing the air. Andrews leaned frantically forward, burrowing his face in the horse's mane so that he would not topple off. By the time they came in sight of the stream, which wound in a flat, treeless gully cut on the level land, the animals were quivering masses of flesh held back by the tiring muscles of the men. When the sound of the stream came to their ears, Miller called back to them, "Jump off and let him go." Andrews lifted one foot from a stirrup. As he did so, the horse, relieved of the pressure of the reins, lunged forward, spilling Andrews to the ground. By the time he got to his feet, the horses were at the stream, on their knees, their heads thrust down into the shallow trickle. Charlie Hoge called from the wagon, "Somebody come here and give me a hand with this brake." With his hand, and with the crook of the elbow of his other arm, he was pulling against the large handbrake at the side of the wagon. The locked wheels of the wagon tore through the short grass, raising dust. Andrew stumbled across the ground and climbed upon the wagon by way of the unmoving wheel spokes. He took the handbrake from Charlie Hoge's grasp. "Got to get them unyoked," Charlie Hoge said. "They'll kill themselves if they go at this much longer." The brake jerked and trembled under Andrew's grasp. The smell of scorched wood and leather came to his nostrils. Charlie Hoge jumped from the wagon and ran to the lead team. With deft movements, he knocked the pins from an oxbow and jerked the oxbow from the yoke, jumping aside as the ox lunged forward, past him, toward the stream. Miller and Schneider stood on either side of the team, trying to quiet the oxen as Charlie Hoge unyoked them. When the last ox was unyoked, the three men went in a stumbling trot across the ground to a spot a few feet upstream from where the animals were lined. "Take it easy," Miller said, when they had flung themselves down on their stomachs beside the narrow, muddy stream. "Just get your mouths wet at first. Try to drink too much and you'll make yourself sick." They wet their mouths and let a little of the water trickle down their throats, and then lay for a few moments on their backs, letting their hands remain behind their heads, the water trickling softly and coolly over them. Then they drank again, more deeply, and rested again. They stayed at the stream all that day, letting the animals have their fill of water, and grazing them on the short, dry grass. "They've lost a lot of strength," Miller said. "There'll be a full day getting even part of it back." Shortly before noon, Charlie Hoge gathered some driftwood that he had found along the stream and started a fire. He put some dry beans on to cook and fried some side meat, which they wolfed immediately with the last of the dried biscuits, washing it all down with quantities of coffee. They slept the afternoon through. While they slept, the fire died down beneath the beans, and Charlie Hoge had to start it again. Later in the darkness, they ate the beans, undercooked and hard, and drank more coffee. They listened for a while to the slow, contented movement of the livestock around them, and, themselves contented, they lay on their bedrolls around the embers of the campfire and slept, hearing in their sleep the quiet, thin gurgle of the stream they had found. They resumed their journey before dawn the next morning, only a little weak from the ordeal of thirst they had endured. Miller led the party with more confidence now that water had been found. He spoke of the water as if it were a live thing that attempted to elude him. "I found it now," he had said back at the camp beside the stream. "It won't get away from me again." And it did not get away. They made their way westward in an erratic course over the featureless land, finding water always at their day's end. Usually they came upon it in darkness, when to Schneider and Andrews it seemed impossible that it could be found. On the 14th day of their journey, they saw the mountains. For much of the previous afternoon, they had traveled toward a low bank of clouds that distantly shrouded the western horizon, and they had traveled into the night before they found water. So they rose late that morning. By the time they awoke, the sky was steel blue and the sun was burning heavily in the east. Andrews rose from his bedroll with a start. They had not remained so late in camp during all the journey. The other men were still in their bedrolls. He started to call to them, but his eyes were caught by the brilliant clearness of the sky. He let his eyes wander unfocused over the high, clear dome, and as they settled to the west, as they always settled, he stiffened and looked more closely. A small, low, uneven hump of dark blue rose on the farthest extremity of land that he could see. He sprang up and went a few steps forward, as if those few steps would enable him to see more closely. Then he turned back to the sleeping men. He went to Miller and shook his shoulder excitedly. "Miller," he said. "Miller, wake up." Miller stirred and opened his eyes and came quickly to a sitting position, instantly awake. "What is it, Will?" "Look," Andrews pointed to the west. "Look over there." Not looking where Andrews pointed, Miller grinned. The mountains. I reckon we should be inside of them sometime today. By this time the others were awake. Schneider looked once at the thin far ridge, shrugged, got his bedroll together, and lashed it behind his saddle. Charlie Hoge gave the mountains a quick glance and turned away, busying himself with the preparations for the morning meal. Late in the morning they began again their long trek westward. Now that their goal was visible, Andrews found that the land upon which they travelled took on features that he had not been able to recognize before. Here the land dipped into a shallow gully. There a small cropping of stones stood out from the earth. Elsewhere in the distance a scrubby patch of trees smudged the greenish yellow of the landscape. Before, his eyes had remained for most of the time fixed upon Miller's back. Now they strained into the distance, toward the uneven hump of earth, now sharp, now blurred, upon the far horizon. And he found that he hungered after them much as he had thirsted after the water. But he knew the mountains were there. He could see them, and he did not know precisely what hunger or thirst they would assuage. The journey to the foothills took them 4 days. Gradually, with their going, the mountains spread and reared upon the land. As they came nearer, Miller grew more impatient. When they nooned at a stream, the number of which increased as they travelled, he was hardly able to wait for the stock to water and graze. He urged them on more and more swiftly, until at last the crack and hiss of Charlie Hoge's whip was regular and steady, and the oxen's lips were flecked and dripping with white foam. They drove late into each night, and were on the move again before the sun rose. Andrews felt that the mountains drew them onward, and drew them with increasing intensity as they came nearer, as if they were a giant lodestone whose influence increased to the degree that it was more nearly approached. As they came nearer, he had again the feeling that he was being absorbed, included in something with which he had had no relation before. But unlike the feeling of absorption he had experienced on the anonymous prairie, this feeling was one which promised, however vaguely, a richness and a fulfillment for which he had no name. Once they came upon a broad trail running north and south. Miller paused upon it, got off his horse, and examined the path that had been worn in the grass. Cattle trail, looks like. They must have started running cattle up from Texas. He shook his head. Wasn't here the last time I come through. Late in the afternoon, just before dark, Andrew saw in the distance the long, thin, parallel lines of a railroad, which found a level course by winding among the gentle hillocks that were beginning to swell upon the land. But Miller had already seen it. My God, Miller said. A railroad. The men increased the paces of their mounts, and in a few minutes halted beside the humped foundation of the road. The tops of the rails gleamed dully in the last light of the sun. Miller got off his horse and stood unmoving for a moment. He shook his head, knelt, and ran his fingers over the smooth steel of the tracks. Then, his hand still upon the metal, he raised his eyes to the mountains, which now loomed high and jagged in the orange and blue light of the afternoon sky. My God, he said again. I never thought they'd get a railroad in this country. Buffalo, Schneider said. He remained on his horse and spat at the rails. Big herd. I never seen big herds yet, where a railroad's been in a few years. Miller did not look up at him. He shook his head and then rose to his feet and mounted his horse. Come on, he said abruptly. We got a long way to go before we set up camp. Though they passed several clear streams, Miller forced them to travel for nearly 3 hours after dark. The travel was slow, for as they approached the mountains the land was more broken. Frequently they had to skirt large groves of trees that grew near the streams, and had to bypass several sharp hills that rose vaguely out of the darkness. Once, in the distance, they saw the glimmering of a light that might have come from the open door of a house. They continued their drive until they were out of its sight, and for some time afterward. Early the next morning, they were in the foothills. A few pines were scattered on the sharply rising sides of the hills that cut off their view of the mountains. Miller, riding ahead, guided the wagon along the land that gently rose up to the hills. He pointed to a sharp strip of pines that descended from one of these, and they made in that direction. The hills dropped sharply into a valley. At the bottom of the cut, the land levelled on either side of a small stream. They followed this draw onto a broad, flat valley, which stretched to the very base of the mountains. "We should hit the river by noon," Miller said. "Then we start to climb." But it was shortly after noon when they came upon the river. The land on the side from which they approached was clear, a few sumacs, already tinged with yellow, and a few clumps of scrub willow straggled along the bank. The bed of the river was wide. It was perhaps 200 yards from the rise on their side to a steep ledge on the other, but for many yards beyond either bank, and in the bed itself, grass was growing, and even a few small trees and shrubs. Through the years, the river had cut away at the earth and solid stone. Now it ran thin and shallow at the center of its path, in a swathe no more than 30 feet in width. It ran smoothly and clearly among the rocks, some flat and some thrust sharply up from the bed, here and there breaking into whirling eddies and white-topped riffles. They nooned at the point at which they had first approached the river. While the other stock was grazing, Miller mounted his horse and rode away in a northeasterly direction, following the river's flow. Andrews wandered away from Charlie Hode and Schneider, who were resting beside the wagon, and sat on the bank. The mountain was a mass of pines. On the far bank, the heavy brown trunks, raised 30 or 40 feet before the boughs, spread to hold deep green clusters of pine needles. In the spaces between the huge trunks were only other trunks, and others, on and on, until the few trees that he could see merged into an image of denseness, impenetrable and dark, compounded of tree and shadow and lightless earth, where no human foot had been. He raised his eyes and followed the surface of the mountain as it jutted steeply upward. The image of the pines was lost, and the image of the denseness, and indeed even the image of the mountain itself. He saw only a deep green mat of needle and bough, which became, in his gaze, without identity or size, like a dry sea, frozen in a moment of calm, the billows regular and eternally still, upon which he might walk for a moment or so, only to sink as he moved upon it, slowly sink into its green mass, until he was in the very heart of the airless forest, a part of it, darkly alone. He sat for a long time upon the bank of the river, his eyes and his mind caught in the vision he had. He was still sitting on the bank when Miller returned from his downstream journey. Miller rode silently up to the resting man, who gathered around him as he drew his horse to a halt and dismounted. "Well," Schneider said, "you been gone long enough? Did you find what you were looking for?" Miller grunted. His eyes went past Schneider and ranged up and down the line of the river that he could see from where he stood. "I don't know," Miller said. "It seems like the country has changed." His voice was quietly puzzled. "Seems like everything is different from what it was." Schneider spat on the ground. "Then we still don't know where we are." "I didn't say that." Miller's eyes continued to range the line of the river. "I've been here before. I've been all over this country before. I just can't seem to get things straight." "If this ain't the damnedest chase I ever been on," Schneider said. "I feel like we're looking for a pin in a stack of hay." He walked angrily away from the little group. He sat down at the wagon, his back against the spokes of a rear wheel, and looked sullenly out over the flat valley across which they had traveled. Miller walked to the bank of the river where Andrews had sat during his absence. For several minutes he stared across the river into the forest of pines that thrust up through the side of the mountain. His legs were slightly spread, and his large shoulders slumped forward. His head drooped, and his arms hung loosely at his sides. Every now and then one of his fingers twitched, and the slight movements turned his hands this way and that. At last he sighed and straightened. "Might as well get started," he said, turning to the men. "We ain't gonna find nothing as long as we sit here." Schneider protested that there was no use for them all to join in the search, since only Miller would know the spot he wanted, if even Miller would know it, when he came upon it. Miller did not answer. He directed Charlie Hode to yoke the oxen. Soon the party was making its way in a southwesterly direction, opposite to the way that Miller had taken alone earlier in the afternoon. All afternoon they made their way upriver. Miller went near the riverbank. Sometimes, when the bank became too brushy, he rode his horse into the river itself, where the horse stumbled over the stones that littered the bed nearly to the edge of either bank. Once a thick grove of pines, which grew up to the very bank of the river, deflected the course of the wagon. The men in the main party skirted the grove, while Miller kept to the riverbed. Andrews, with Schneider and Charlie Hoge, did not see Miller for more than an hour. When finally the wedge-shaped grove was skirted, he saw Miller far ahead of them, upriver, leaning out from his saddle to inspect the far bank. They made camp early that night, only an hour or so after the sun went down behind the mountains. With darkness, a chill came in the air. Charlie Hoge threw more branches on the fire and dragged upon the branches a sizable log which Schneider, in an excess of energy and anger, had cut from a pine tree whose top had been snapped the winter before by the weight of snow and wind. The fire roared violently in the quiet, driving the men back from it and lighting their faces a deep red. But after the fire died down to large embers, the chill came again. Andrews got an extra blanket from the wagon and added it to his thin bedroll. In the morning, silently, they broke camp. Andrews and Charlie Hoge worked together. Schneider and Miller, apart from each other, stood apart from the two who worked. Schneider whittled savagely on a slender bough of pine, the shavings piled up on the ground where he was sitting, between his upraised knees. Miller stood again at the bank of the river, his back to the others, and gazed into the shallow flow of clear water that came from the direction in which they were to travel. The morning's journey began lethargically. Schneider slumped in his saddle. When he looked up from the ground, his eyes came to rest sullenly upon Miller's back. Charlie Hoge snapped the long whip perfunctorily over the ears of the lead oxen, and drank frequently from one of the bottles he kept in the box under his spring seat. Only Miller, who seemed to Andrews to become less and less a part of the group, kept restlessly ahead, now on the bank, now on the edge of the riverbed, now in the water itself, which flowed whitely around the fetlocks of his horse. Miller's restlessness began to affect Andrews, and he found himself gazing with an increasing intensity at the anonymous green forest that edged the river and defined the course of their passage. In the middle of the morning, ahead of them, Miller halted his horse. The horse stood near the center of the riverbed. As the others came up close to him, Andrews could see that Miller was gazing thoughtfully, but without real interest, at a spot on the bank opposite them. When the wagon halted, Miller turned to the group and said quietly, "This is the place. Charlie, turn your wagon down here and come straight across." For a moment, none of them moved. Where Miller pointed was no different from any of the places along the unchanging stretch of mountainside that they had passed that morning or the previous afternoon. Miller said again, "Come on, turn your wagon straight across." Charlie Hoge shrugged. He cracked his whip above the left ear of the off-ox and set the handbrake for the descent down the heavily sloping riverbank. Schneider and Andrews went ahead, following closely behind Miller, who turned his horse straight into the thick forest of pines. For a moment, as he and Schneider and Miller pressed their horses directly into the face of the forest, Andrews had a sensation of sinking, as if he were being absorbed downward into a softness without boundary or mark. The sound of their horses' breathing, the clop of their hooves, and even the few words the men spoke, all were absorbed in the quiet of the forest, so that all sound came muted and distant and calm, one sound much the same as another. Whether it was the snort of a horse or a spoken word, all was reduced to soft thuds which seemed to come not from themselves, but from the forest, as if there beat within it a giant heart for anyone to hear. Schneider's voice, made soft and dull and unconcerned by the forest, came from beside Andrews. "Where the hell are we going? I don't see no sign of buffalo here." Miller pointed downward. "Look what we're on." The horse's hooves, Andrews saw, was sliding the smallest bit upon what he had thought was the grayish-green bed of the forest. A closer look showed him that they were riding over a series of long, flat stones that grew up from the base of the mountain and wound among the trees. "They don't leave no track here that a man would notice," Miller said. Then he leaned forward in the saddle. "But look up there." The stone trail ended abruptly ahead of them, and a natural clearing widened among the trees and wound gradually up the side of the mountain. The bed of this clearing held a broad, regular swathe of earth, worn bare of grass. Raw earth and stones showed the boundaries of the path. Miller kicked his horse up to the point where it began and dismounted. He squatted in the middle of the path and inspected it carefully. This is their road. His hand caressed the hard-packed contours of the earth. There's been a herd over it not too long ago. Looks like a big one. By God, Schneider said. By God. Miller rose. It's gonna be hard climbing from now on. Better tie your horses to the tail of the wagon. Charlie'll be needing our help. The buffalo trail went up the mountainside at an irregular angle. The wagon made its way up the steeply pitched incline. It went slowly upward, and then dipped sharply down in a hollow, and then went upward again. Andrews, after he had hitched his horse to the tailgate, strode beside the wagon with long, strong steps. The fresh, high air filled his lungs, and gave him a strength he was not aware of having felt before. Beside the wagon, he turned to the two men who were lagging some distance behind. "Come on," he called in an excess of exuberance and strength. He laughed a little, excitedly. "We'll leave you behind." Miller shook his head. Schneider grinned at him. Neither man spoke. They shuffled awkwardly over the rough trail. Their movements were slow and resigned and deliberate, as if made by old men walking to no purpose and with great reluctance. Andrews shrugged and turned away from them. He looked ahead at the trail eagerly, as if each turn would bring him a new surprise. He went in front of the wagon, striding along easily and swiftly. He loped down the small hollows and climbed the rises with long, heavy thrusts of his legs. At a high rise he paused. For a moment the wagon was out of his sight. He stood on a large stone that jutted up between two pines and looked down. The mountain fell off sharply from the trail, and he could see for miles in either direction the river they had crossed only a few minutes before, and the land stretching level to the foothills that lay behind them. The land looked calm and undisturbed. He wondered idly at the half-submerged fear he had had of it during their crossing. Now that they were over it, it had the appearance of a friend known for a long while. It offered him a sense of security, a sense of comfort, and a knowledge that he could return to it and have that security and comfort whenever he wished. He turned. Above him, before him, the land was shrouded and unknown. He could not see it or know where they went, but his view of the other country, the level country behind him, touched upon what he was to see, and he felt a sense of peace. He heard his name called. The sound came to him faintly from the trail below where the wagon was making its way upward. He leapt down from the rock and trotted back to the wagon, which had halted before a sharp rise of the trail. Miller and Schneider were standing at the rear wheels. Charlie Hoge sat on the clip seat, holding the handbrake against the backward roll of the wagon. "Give us a hand here," Miller said. "This pull's a little steep for the oxen." "All right," Andrews said. He noticed that his breath was coming rapidly and that there was a slight ringing in his ears. He set his shoulder to the lower rear wheel, as Schneider had to the one pitched at a higher level on the other side of the trail. Miller faced him and pulled at a large round wheel spoke as Andrews pushed. Charlie Hoge's whip whistled behind them and then cracked ahead of them over the oxen's heads as his voice raised in a long, loud "Hurrup!" The oxen inched forward, straining. Charlie Hoge released the handbrake, and for an instant the men at the wheels felt a heavy, sickening backward roll. Then the weight of the oxen took hold, and as the men strained at the wheels, the wagon slowly began to move forward and upward on the trail. The blood pounded in Andrew's head. Dimly, he saw muscles like large ropes coil around Miller's forearms, and saw the veins stand out heavily on his forehead. As the wheel turned, he found another spoke and put his shoulder to it. His breath came in gasps that sent sharp pains in his throat and chest. Bright points lighted the dimness in his eyes, and the points whirled. He closed his eyes. Suddenly he felt air in front of his hands, and then the sharp stones of the trail were digging in his back. As from a great distance, he heard voices. Schneider said, "He looks kind of blue, don't he?" He opened his eyes. The brightness danced before him, and the dark green needles of the pines were very close, then very far away, and a patch of blue sky was revealed above the needles. He heard the rasping sound of his own breath. His arms lay helplessly at his sides, and the heaving of his chest pushed the back of his head against a rock. Otherwise, he did not move. "He'll be all right." Miller's voice was slow and measured and easy. Andrews turned his head. Schneider and Miller were squatting to his left. The wagon was some distance away, atop the rise which had momentarily halted it. "What happened?" Andrews' voice was thin and weak. "You passed out," Miller told him. Schneider chuckled. "In these mountains, you gotta take it easy," Miller continued. "Air's thinner than what a body's used to." Schneider shook his head, still chuckling. "Boy, you was sure going great there for a while. Thought you'd get clean over the mountain before it hit you." Andrews smiled weakly and raised himself on one elbow. The movement caused his breath, which had quieted somewhat, again to come rapidly and heavily. "Why didn't you slow me down?" Miller shrugged. "This is something a body's got to find out for itself. It don't do no good to tell him." Andrews got to his feet and swayed dizzily for a moment. He caught at Miller's shoulder and then straightened and stood on his own strength. "I'm all right. Let's get going." They walked up the rise to the wagon. Andrews was breathing heavily again, and his hands were shaking by the time they had gone the short distance. Miller said, "I'd tell you to ride your horse for a while till you get your strength back, but it wouldn't be a good idea. Once you get your wind broke, it's better to keep on going afoot. If you rode your horse now, you'd just have it all to do over again." "I'm all right," Andrews said. They started off again. This time Andrews kept behind Miller and Schneider and tried to imitate their awkward, stumbling gait. After a while, he discovered that the secret was to keep his limbs loose and let his body fall forward, and to use his legs only to keep his body from the ground. Though his breath still came in shallow gasps, and though after a slightly steep ascent the light still whirled before his eyes, he found that the peculiar shambling rhythm of the climb prevented him from becoming too tired. Every 45 minutes Miller called for a halt, and the men rested. Andrews noticed that neither Miller nor Schneider sat when they rested. They stood upright, their chests heaving regularly. At the instant the heaving subsided, they started off again. After discovering the agony of getting up from a sitting or lying position, Andrews began standing with them. It was much easier and much less tiring to resume the climb from a standing position than from a sitting one. Throughout the afternoon, the men walked beside the wagon, and when the trail narrowed, they walked behind it, putting their shoulders to the wheels when a slope caused the hooves of the oxen to slip and slide on the hard trail. By mid-afternoon, they had pushed and tugged halfway up the side of the mountain. Andrew's legs were numb, and his shoulder burned from repeated pushings against the wagon wheel. Even when he rested, the sharp, thin air, cool and dry, pricked against his throat and caused sharp pains in his chest. He longed to rest, to sit on the ground, or to lie on the soft pine needles just off the trail. But he knew what the pain of rising would be. So he stood with the others when they rested, and looked up the trail to where it disappeared among the thick pines. Late in the afternoon, the trail made a turning so abrupt that Charlie Hodge had to back the wagon up several times, angling it more to his right each time, so that finally it could negotiate the angle, its right wheels brushing against the pines, the left coming dangerously close to the brink of a sheer gully that descended 300 or 400 feet. Past the turning, the party halted. Miller pointed ahead. The trail went steeply up to a point between two rough peaks, dark and jagged against the bright afternoon sky. "There it is," Miller said, "just beyond them peaks." Charlie Hodge cracked his whip above the oxen's ears, and whoops. Startled, the oxen lurched forward and upward. Their hooves dug into the earth and slipped. The men again put their shoulders against the wheels of the wagon. "Don't push them too hard," Miller called to Charlie Hodge. "It's a long pull, all the way to the top." Foot by foot, they pulled and pushed the wagon up the last steep ascent. Sweat came out on their faces and was instantly dried by the high, cool air. Andrews heard the groaning sound of air pulled into lungs and realized that the sound he heard was his own, so loud that it almost drowned out the breathing of the other men, the creak of the wagon as it strained unnaturally upward, and the heavy sounds of the oxen's breathing and plodding and slipping on the trail. He gasped for air as if he were drowning. His arms, hanging loose as his shoulder ground against the spokes, wanted to flail, as if they might raise him to more air. The numbness of his legs intensified, and suddenly they were numb no longer. He felt that hundreds of needles were pricking into his flesh, and that the needles warmed, became white-hot, and burned outward from his bone to his flesh. He felt that the sockets of his bones, ankle, knee, and hip, were being crushed by the weight they impelled forward. Blood pounded in his head, throbbed against his ears, until even the sound of his own breathing was submerged, and a red film came over his eyes. He could not see before him. He pushed blindly, his will supplanting his strength, becoming his body, until his pain submerged them both. Then he pitched forward, away from the wagon. The sharp stones on the path cut into his hands, but he did not move. He stayed for several moments on his hands and knees, and watched with a detached curiosity the blood from his cut palms seeping out and darkening the earth upon which they rested. After a few moments, he was aware that the wagon had come to a halt just as he had pitched away from it, and that it was standing level now, no longer at an angle from the trail. On his right, the sheer side of a rock thrust upward. To his left, above the wagon, no more than 30 feet away, was another very like it. He tried to get to his feet, but he slipped to his knees and remained there for a moment more. Still on his hands and knees, he saw Charlie Hoge sitting erect on the wagon seat, looking out before him, not moving. Miller and Schneider were hanging on the wheels they had pushed. They, too, were looking before them, and they were silent. Andrews crawled a few feet forward and pushed himself upright. He wiped his bloody hands on his shirt. Miller turned to him. "There it is," he said quietly. "Take a look." Andrews walked up to him and stood looking where he pointed. For perhaps 300 yards, the trail cut down between the pines, but at that point, abruptly, the land leveled. A long, narrow valley, flat as the top of a table, wound among the mountains. Lush grass grew on the bed of the valley and waved gently in the breeze as far as the eye could see. A quietness seemed to rise from the valley. It was the quietness, the stillness, the absolute calm of a land where no human foot had touched. Andrews found that despite his exhaustion, he was holding his breath. He expelled the air from his lungs as gently as he could, so as not to disturb the silence. Miller tensed and touched Andrew's arm. "Look," he pointed to the southwest. A blackness moved on the valley, below the dark pines that grew on the opposite mountain. Andrew strained his eyes. At the edges of the patch there was a slight ripple, and then the patch itself throbbed like a great body of water moved by obscure currents. The patch, though it appeared small at this distance, was, Andrews guessed, more than a mile in length and nearly half a mile in width. "Buffalo," Miller whispered. "My God," Andrew said. "How many are there?" 2,000-3,000 maybe. And maybe more. This valley winds in and out of these hills. We can just see a little part of it from here. No telling what you'll find on farther." For several moments more, Andrew stood beside Miller and watched the herd. He could, at the distance from which he viewed, make out no shape, distinguish no animal from another. From the north, a cool wind began to rise. It came through the pass. Andrew shivered. The sun had fallen far below the mountain opposite them, and its shadow darkened the place where they stood. "Let's get down and set up camp," Miller said. "It'll be dark soon." Slowly, as if a procession, the group made its way down the incline to the valley. They were at the level ground before dark rolled from the mountain. 4. They set up camp near a small spring. The spring water flashed in the last light as it poured thinly over smooth rock into a pool at the base of the mountain, and thence overflowed into a narrow stream half hidden by the thick grass of the valley. "There's a little lake a few miles to the south," Miller said. "That's where the buffalo go to water." Charlie Hoge unyoked the oxen and set them to graze on the valley grass. With the help of Andrews, he dragged the large sheet of canvas from the wagon. Then he cut several slender boughs from a young pine, and the two men constructed a box frame, over which they stretched the canvas, securing it carefully and tucking it so that the edges made a floor upon the grass. Then, from the wagon, they lugged the boxes of gunpowder and placed them within the small square tent. "If I got this powder wet," Charlie Hoge chuckled, "Miller'd kill me." After he had finished helping Charlie Hoge, Andrews got an axe and went with Schneider a little way up the side of the mountain and began cutting a supply of wood for the camp. They let the logs remain where they were felled, hacking off the smaller branches and piling them beside the trees. "We'll get the horses and drag them down later," Schneider said. By dark, they had felled half a dozen fair-sized trees. Each returned to the camp with an armload of branches, and they dragged between them the trunk of a small tree. Charlie Hoge had built a fire against a huge boulder, which was twice the height of any of the men, and so deeply creviced at one point that it formed a natural draught for the smoke. Though the fire was blazing high, he already had the coffee pot resting at one edge of the fire, and on another he had set the familiar pot of soaked beans. "Last night we'll have to eat beans," Charlie Hoge said. "Tomorrow we'll have buffalo meat. Maybe I'll even get a little small game, and we'll have a stew." Across the trunks of two close-set pines, he had nailed a heavy straight bough. Upon this bough, neatly hung, were his utensils: a large skillet, 2 pans, a ladle, several knives whose handles were discolored and scarred, but whose blades gleamed in the leaping flame, a small hatchet, and an axe. Resting on the ground was a large iron kettle, the outside black, but the inside gleaming a dull grayish silver. Beside this, against the trunk of one of the trees, was the large box that contained the other provisions. After the men finished eating, they hollowed long oval depressions in the loose pine needles. In these depressions they laid crisscross small branches, and upon the branches leveled the pine needles they had scooped out, so that they could put their bedrolls upon a springy mattress that held their bodies lightly and comfortably. They placed their bedrolls close to the fire, near the boulder. Thus they were partially protected from weather coming from the north or west across the valley. The forest would hold off the weather from the east. By the time their beds were made, the fire had died to grey-coated embers. Miller watched the coals intently, his face a dark red in their glow. Charlie Hoge lighted the lantern that hung on the bough beside his cooking utensils. The feeble light was lost in the darkness. He carried the lantern to the fire where the men sat. Miller rose and got the heavy iron kettle from the ground and set it squarely in the bed of coals. Then he took the lantern and handed it to Charlie Hoge, who followed him to the large box of provisions beside the tree. From the box, Miller removed 2 large bars of lead and carried them to the fire. He stuck them into the kettle, crossing them so that their weight did not upset it. Then he went to the little square tent that Charlie Hoge and Will Andrews had constructed, and took from it a box of powder and a smaller box of caps. He carefully tucked the canvas back around the remaining powder before he left. At the campfire, he knelt beside his saddle, which rested near his bedroll, and took from his saddlebag a large loose sack, which was secured at the mouth by a leather thong. He untied the thong and spread the cloth on the ground. Hundreds of dully gleaming brass shell cases descended in a loose mound. Andrews edged closer to the 2 men. The lead in the blackened kettle shifted above the heat. Miller inspected the kettle and moved it so that the heat came through more evenly. Then, with a hatchet, he opened the box of gunpowder and tore open the heavy paper that protected the black grains. Between his thumb and forefinger, he took a pinch and threw it on the fire, where it blazed for an instant with a blue-white flame. Satisfied, Miller nodded and dug again into his saddlebag. He withdrew a bulky flat object, hinged on one side, that opened to disclose a number of shallow depressions evenly spaced and connected to each other by tiny grooves. He carefully cleaned this mold with a greased rag. When Miller closed it, Andrews could see a tiny cup-like mouth at its top. Again, Miller reached into his bag and took out a large ladle. He inserted it in the now bubbling kettle of lead, and delicately spooned the molten lead into the mouth of the bullet mold. The hot lead crackled on the cool mold. A drop spattered on Miller's hand, which held the mold, but he did not flinch. After the mold was filled, Miller thrust it into a bucket of cold water that Charlie Hoge had brought up to him. The mold hissed in the water, which bubbled in white froth. Then Miller withdrew the mold and spilled the bullets on the cloth beside the cartridge cases. When the pile of lead bullets was about equal in size to the pile of brass cartridges, Miller put the mold aside to cool. Quickly but carefully he examined the molded bullets. Occasionally he smoothed the base of one with a small file. More rarely he tossed a defective one back into the iron kettle, which he had set back from the fire. Before he put the bullets into a new pile beside the empty brass shells, he rubbed the base of each pellet in a square of beeswax. From the square container beside the powder box, he took the tiny caps and thrust them easily into the empty shells, tamping them carefully with a small black tool. Again from his saddlebag he drew out a narrow spoon and a crumpled wad of newspaper. With the spoon he measured a quantity of gunpowder. Over the opened box of gunpowder he held a shell casing and filled it 3/4 full of the black gunpowder. He tapped the casing sharply on the edge of the box to level the powder, and with his free hand tore a bit from the crumpled newspaper and wadded that into a shell. Finally he picked up one of the lead bullets and jammed it into the loaded shell case with the heel of his palm. Then, with his strong white teeth, he crimped the edge of the brass casing where it held the butt of the bullet and threw the bullet carelessly into yet a third pile. For several minutes the three men watched Miller reload the shell casings. Charlie Hodge watched delightedly, grinning and nodding his head at Miller's skill. Schneider watched sleepily, indifferently, yawning now and then. Andrews watched with intent interest, trying to impress in his memory the precise nature of each of Miller's movements. After a while, Schneider roused himself and spoke to Andrews. "Mr. Andrews, we got work to do. Get your knives, and let's sharpen them up." Andrews looked at Miller, who jerked his head in the direction of the large provisions box. In the dim light of the lantern, Andrews pawed through the box. At last he found the flat leather case that Miller had got for him back in Butcher's Crossing. He took the case back to the fire, which was now leaping in the flame of a fresh log that Charlie Hodge had thrown on. He opened the case. The knives gleamed brightly in the firelight. The bone handles were clean and unscarred. Schneider had got his knives from his saddlebag. He removed one from its case and tested its edge against his calloused thumb. He shook his head and spat heartily on a long greyish-brown whetstone, whose centre was worn away so that the surface of the stone described a long curve. With the flat of his knife he distributed the spittle evenly on the surface. Then he worked the blade on the stone in a long oval, holding the blade at a careful angle, and managing the oval movement so that the stone bit equally into each part of the blade. Andrews watched him for a few moments. Then he selected a knife and tested his own blade on his thumb. The edge pressed into the soft hump of flesh, but it did not bite. "You'll have to sharpen them all," Schneider said, glancing up at him. "A new knife's got no cutting edge." Andrews nodded and took from his case a new whetstone. He spat on it, as he had seen Schneider do, and spread the spittle upon the surface. "You ought to soak your stone in oil for a day or two before you use it," Schneider said, "but I guess it don't make no difference this time." Andrews began rotating the blade upon the stone. His movements were awkward, and he could not find the rhythm which would allow every part of the blade to be equally wetted. "Here," Schneider said, dropping his own knife and stone. "You got the blade pitched too high. You might get a sharp edge like that, but it wouldn't last more than 1 or 2 skins. Give it to me." Schneider skillfully ran the blade over the stone, whipping it back and forward so swiftly that Andrews could hardly see it. Schneider turned the blade over and showed Andrews the angle at which he held it to the stone. "You get a long cutting edge like this," Schneider said. "It'll last you near a full day's skinning without sharpening again. You make your cut too narrow, you'll ruin your knife." He handed the knife butt first to Andrews. "Try it." Andrews touched the blade to his thumb. He felt a hot little pain. A thin line of red appeared diagonally across the ball of his thumb. He watched it dumbly as it widened, and as the blood ran irregularly in the tiny whorls of his thumb. Schneider grinned. "That's the way a knife should cut. You got a good set of knives." Under Schneider's supervision, Andrews sharpened the other knives. As he sharpened each knife, of a different shape or size, Schneider explained its use to him. "This one here is for long work," Schneider said. "You can slit a bull from throat to pecker without taking it out of the skin. And this one's for close work, around the hooves. This one's good for dressing your meat down once the bull's skinned, and this one's for scraping the skin once she's off. When at last Schneider was satisfied with the knives, Andrews returned them to their cases. From the new movement to which he had been introduced, his arm was tired. From the tightness with which he had held the knives while sharpening them, his right hand was numb. A chill wind blew from the pass. Andrews shivered and moved closer to the fire. Miller's voice came from the darkness behind the three men who sat silently around the campfire. "Everything ready for tomorrow?" The men turned. The firelight caught the buttons on Miller's shirt and the fringes of his open buckskin jacket, and glinted on his heavy nose and forehead. His dark beard blended into the darkness, so that Andrews had the momentary impression of a head floating above the merest suggestion of a body. Then Miller came up to them and sat down. "Everything's ready," Schneider said. "Good." Miller drew a bullet from one of the bulging pockets of his jacket. On a flat rock near the fire, he marked with the lead tip a long irregular oval that curved nearly into a semicircle. "Near as I can remember," Miller said, "this is the shape of the valley. We only saw a little bit of it this afternoon. A few miles on, around this first bend, it widens out to maybe 4 or 5 miles across, and it goes on 20 or 25 miles. It don't look like a lot of ground, but the grass is thick and rich, and it grows back almost as fast as it's cropped. It'll feed a hell of a lot of buffalo." In the fire, a burned-through log fell and sent into the air a shower of sparks that glowed and died in the darkness. "Our job is easy," Miller went on. "We start our kill with the little herd we saw this morning, and then we work down the valley. Nothing to worry about. There ain't no way out of this canyon except the way we came through. Leastways, there's no way for buffalo. Mountains steepen around the first bend. Lots of places there's nothing up but sheer rock." "This'll be the main camp?" Schneider asked. Miller nodded. "As we work down the valley, Charlie'll follow us with the wagon to pick up the hides. We'll bale them back here. We might have to make a few camps away from here, but not many. When we get to the end of the valley, if there are any buffalo left, we can herd them back up toward here. In the long run, it'll save us time." "Just one thing," Schneider said. "Start us off easy. My Andrews here is going to need a few days before he'll be much help, and I don't want to have to skin stiff buffalo." "The way this is set up," Miller said, "there's no hurry. If we had to, we could stay here all winter, picking them off." Charlie Hodge threw another log on the already blazing fire. In the intense heat, the log flared instantly into flame. For that moment, the faces of the 4 men gathered around the fire were lighted fully, and each could see the other as if in daylight. Then the outer bark of the log burned away, and the firelight died to a steady flame. Charlie Hodge waited for several minutes. Then, with a shovel, he banked the flames with dead ashes, so that in the yellow light of the lantern the men could see only the whitish-yellow smoke struggling upward through the ashes. Without further words, they turned into their bedrolls. For a long time after they had bedded down, Will Andrews listened to the silence around him. For a while the acrid smell of the smothered pine logs burning warmed his nostrils. Then the wind shifted, and he could no longer smell the smoke or hear the heavy breaths of the sleeping men around him. He turned so that he faced the side of the mountain over which they had traveled. From the darkness that clung about the earth, he lifted his gaze and followed the dim outlines of particular trees as they rose from the darkness and gradually gained distinctness against the deep blue cloudless sky that twinkled with the light of the clear stars. Even with an extra blanket on his bedroll, he was chilled. He could see the gray cloud of his breath as he breathed the sharp night air. His eyes closed upon the image of a tall, conical pine tree outlined blackly against the luminous sky, and despite the cold, he slept soundly until morning. Five. When Andrews awoke, Charlie Hodge was already up and dressed. He huddled over the fire, adding twigs to the coals that had been kept overnight by the banking. Andrews lay for a moment in the comparative warmth of his bedroll and watched his breath fog the air. Then he flung the blankets aside, and, shivering, got into his boots, which were stiff and hard from the cold. Without lacing them, he clumped over to the fire. The sun had not yet come over the mountain against which their camp was set, but on the opposite mountain, at the top, a mass of pine trees was lighted by the early sun. A patch of turning aspen flamed deep gold in the green of the pines. Miller and Schneider arose before Charlie Hodge's coffee began to boil. Miller beckoned to Andrews. The three men trudged out of their cover of trees onto the level valley, where 100 yards away their hobbled horses were grazing. They led the animals back to the camp and saddled them before the coffee, the side meat, and the fried mush were ready. "They ain't moved much," Miller said, pointing through the trees. Andrew saw the thin black line of the herd strung out around the bend of the valley. He drank his coffee hurriedly, scalding his mouth. Miller ate his breakfast calmly, slowly. After he finished, he went a little way into the forest, and from a low branch selected a forked bough and chopped it off about 2 feet from the fork. With his knife, he trimmed the fork so that the 2 small branches protruded from the main branch about 6 inches. Then he sharpened the thick base of the main branch. From his pile of goods beside his bedroll, he got his gun and unwrapped the oilskin which protected it from the night dampness. He inspected the gun carefully and thrust it into the long holster attached to his saddle. The 3 men mounted their horses. In the open valley, Miller pulled his horse up and spoke to the 2 men on either side of him. "We'll go straight to them. Point your horses behind mine and don't let them swerve out. As long as we keep straight at them, they won't scare." Andrews rode behind Miller, his horse at a slow walk. His hands ached. He looked at his knuckles. The skin was stretched white across the bones. He relaxed his grip on the reins and let his shoulders slump. He was breathing heavily. By the time they had gone halfway across the width of the valley, the herd, slowly grazing, had rounded the bend. Miller led the 2 men up near the base of the mountain. "We'll have to go easy from here," he said. "You never know how the wind will be blowing in these mountains. Tie your horses up. We'll go on foot." Walking one behind the other with Miller in the lead, the men made their way around the blunt rocky base of the mountain. Miller halted suddenly and held up one hand. Without turning his head, he spoke to those behind him in the normal tones of conversation. "They're just ahead, not more than 300 yards away. Go easy now." He squatted and ripped off a few blades of grass, and with his hand held high let them fall to the ground. The wind carried the blades back toward him. He nodded. "Wind's right." He rose and went forward more slowly. Andrews, carrying over one shoulder the bag containing Miller's ammunition, shifted his burden, and as he shifted it, he saw a movement in the herd in front of him. Again, without turning his head, Miller said, "Just keep walking straight. As long as you don't move out of the line, they won't get scared." Now Andrews could see the herd clearly. Against the pale yellow-green of the grass, the dark umber of the buffalo stood out sharply, but merged into the deeper color of the pine forest on the steep mountainside behind them. Many of the buffalo were lying at ease upon the soft valley grass. Those were mere humps, like dark rocks, without identity or shape. But a few stood at the edges of the herd, like sentinels. Some were grazing lightly, and others stood unmoving, their huge, furry heads slumped between their forelegs, which were so matted with long, dark fur that their shapes could not be seen. One old bull carried thick scars on his sides and flanks that could be seen even at the distance where the 3 men walked. The bull stood somewhat apart from the other animals. He faced the approaching men, his head lowered, his upward curving ebony horns shining in the sunlight, bright against the dark mop of hair that hung over his head. The bull did not move as they came nearer. Miller paused again. "No need for all of us to go on. Fred, you wait here. Will, you follow me. We'll have to try to skirt them. Buffalo always face downwind. Can't get a good shot from this angle." Schneider dropped to his knees and let himself down to a prone position. With his chin resting on his folded hands, he regarded the herd. Miller and Andrews cut to their left. They had walked about 15 yards when Miller raised his hand, palm outward. Andrews halted. They're beginning to stir, Miller said. Go easy. Many of the buffalo at the outer edges of the herd had got to their feet, raising themselves stiffly on their forelegs, and then upon their hind legs, wobbling for a moment until they had taken a few steps forward. The two men remained still. It's the moving that stirs them up, Miller said. You could stand right in front of them all day and not bother them, if you could get there without moving. The two men began again their slow movement forward. When the herd showed another sign of restlessness, Miller dropped to his hands and knees. Andrews came up behind him, awkwardly dragging the sack of ammunition at his side. When they were broadside to the herd, and about 150 yards away from it, they stopped. Miller stuck into the ground the forked branch he had been carrying, and rested his gun barrel on the fork. Andrews crawled up beside him. Miller grinned at him. Watch the way I do it, boy. You aim just a little behind the shoulder blade, and about 2/3 of the way down from the top of the hump. That is, if you're shooting from behind, the way we are. This is the heart shot. It's better to get them a little from the front, through the lights. That way they don't die so quick, but they don't run so far after they're shot. But with the wind, you take a chance, trying to get in front of them. Keep your eye on the big bull, the one with the scars all over him. His hide ain't worth a damn, but he looks like the leader. You always try to pick out the leader of a herd and get him first. They ain't apt to run so far without a leader. Andrews watched intently as Miller lined his gun upon the old bull. Both of Miller's eyes were open along the sights of his gun barrel. The stock was tight against his cheek. The muscles of his right hand tensed. There was a heavy crack of the rifle. The stock kicked back against Miller's shoulder, and a small cloud of smoke drifted away from the mouth of the gun barrel. At the sound of the gun, the old bull jumped, as if startled by a sharp blow on his rump. Without hurry, he began loping away from the men who lay on their bellies. Damn, Miller said. You've missed him, Andrew said. There was amazement in his voice. Miller laughed shortly. I didn't miss him. That's the trouble with heart-shot buffalo. They'll go 100 yards sometimes. The other buffalo began to be aroused by the movement of their leader. Slowly at first, a few raised themselves on their thick forelegs, and then suddenly the herd was a dark mass of moving fur as it ran in the direction its leader had taken. In the closely packed herd, the humps of the animals bobbed rhythmically, almost liquidly, and the roar of the hooves came upon the two men who lay watching. Miller shouted something that Andrews could not distinguish in the noise. The buffalo passed their wounded leader and ran beyond him some 300 yards, where their running gradually spent itself, and where they stood, milling uneasily about. The old bull stood alone behind them, his massive head sunk below his hump. His tail twitched once or twice, and he shook his head. He turned around several times, as another animal might have done before sleeping, and finally stood facing the two men who were more than 200 yards away from him. He took 3 steps toward them and paused again. Then, stiffly, he fell on his side, his legs straight out from his belly. The legs jerked, and then he was still. Miller rose from his prone position and brushed the grass off the front of his clothing. Well, we got the leader. They won't run so far the next time. He picked up his gun, his shooting stick, and a long wire-handled cleaning patch that he had laid beside him. Want to go over and take a look? Won't we scare the rest of them? Miller shook his head. They had their scare. They won't be so spooky now. They walked across the grass to where the dead buffalo lay. Miller glanced at it casually and scuffed its fur with the toe of his boot. Ain't worth skinning, he said, but you have to get the leader out of the way if you're going to do any good with the rest of them. Andrews regarded the felled buffalo with some mixture of feeling. On the ground, unmoving, it no longer had that kind of wild dignity and power that he had imputed to it only a few minutes before. And though the body made a huge dark mound on the earth, its size seemed somehow diminished. The shaggy black head was cocked a little to one side, held so by one horn that had fallen upon an unevenness of the ground. The other horn was broken at the tip. The small eyes, half closed, but still brightly shining in the sun, stared gently ahead. The hooves were surprisingly small, almost delicate, cloven neatly like those of a calf. The thin ankles seemed incapable of having supported the weight of the great animal. The broad swelling side was covered with scars. Some were so old that the fur had nearly covered them, but others were new and shone flat and dark blue on the flesh. From one nostril a drop of blood thickened in the sun and dropped upon the grass. He wasn't good for much longer anyway, Miller said. In another year he would have weakened and been picked off by the wolves. He spat on the grass beside the animal. Buffalo never dies of old age. He's either killed by a man or dragged down by a wolf. Andrews glanced across the body of the buffalo and saw the herd beyond. It had settled. A few of the animals were still milling about, but more of them were grazing or resting on the grass. "We'll give them a few minutes," Miller said. "They're still a mite skittish." They walked around the buffalo that Miller had killed and made their way in the direction of the herd. They walked slowly, but with less caution than they had during their first approach. When they came within 250 yards, Miller stopped and tore off a small handful of grass blades. He held them up and let them fall. They fell slowly downward, scattering this way and that. Miller nodded in satisfaction. "Wind's died," he said. "We can get on the other side and run them back to our camp. Less hauling of the skins that way." They made a wide circle, approached, and stopped a little more than 100 yards away from the closely bunched herd. Andrews lay on his stomach beside Miller, who adjusted his Sharp's rifle in the crotch of his shooting stick. "Should get 2 or 3 this time before they run," he said. He examined the disposition of the herd with some care for several minutes. More of the buffalo lowered themselves to the grass. Miller confined his attention to the buffalo milling around the edges of the herd. He leveled his rifle toward a large bull that seemed more active than the others, and squeezed gently on the trigger. At the noise of his shot, a few of the buffalo got to their feet. They all turned their heads in the direction from which the shot came. They seemed to stare at the little cloud of smoke that rose from the barrel of the gun and thinned in the still air. The bull gave a start forward and ran for a few steps, stopped, and turned to face the 2 men who lay on the ground. Blood dropped slowly from both nostrils, and then dropped more swiftly, until it came in 2 crimson streams. The buffalo that had begun to move away at the sound of the shot, seeing their new leader hesitate, stopped in wait for him. "Got him through the lights," Miller said. "Watch." He reloaded his rifle as he spoke, and swung it around in search of the most active of the remaining buffalo. As he spoke, the wounded bull swayed unsteadily, staggered, and with a heavy lurch fell sideways. 3 smaller animals came up curiously to the fallen bull. For a few seconds they stared and sniffed at the warm blood. One of them lifted its head and bowled, and started to trot away. Immediately beside Andrews, another shot sounded, and the younger bull jumped, startled, ran a few feet, and paused, the blood streaming from its nostrils. In quick succession, Miller shot 3 more buffalo. By the time he had shot the 3rd, the entire herd was on its feet, milling about. But the animals did not run. They wandered about in a loose circle, bawling, looking for a leader to take them away. "I've got them," Miller whispered fiercely. "By God, they're buffaloed." He upended his sack of ammunition, so that several dozen shells were quickly available to him. When he could reach them, Andrews collected the empty cartridges. After he had downed his 6th buffalo, Miller opened the breech of his rifle and swabbed out the powder-cake barrel with the cleaning patch tied on the end of the long, stiff wire. "Run back to the camp and get me a fresh rifle and some more cartridges," he said to Andrews, "and bring a bucket of water." Andrews crawled on his hands and knees in a straight line away from Miller. After several minutes, he looked back over his shoulder. He got to his feet and trotted in a wide circle around the herd. When he turned around the bend in the valley, he saw Schneider sitting with his back propped against a rock, his hat pulled low over his eyes. At the sound of Andrews' approach, Schneider pushed his hat back and looked up at him. "Miller has them buffaloed," Andrews said, panting. "They just stand there and let him shoot them. They don't even run." "God damn it," Schneider said quietly. "He's got to stand. I was afraid of it. Sounded like the shots were coming too regular and close." From the distance they heard the sound of a shot. It was faint and inoffensive where they heard it. "They just stand there," Andrews said again. Schneider pulled his hat over his eyes and leaned against his rock. "You better hope they run pretty soon, else we'll be working all night." Andrews went toward the horses, which were standing close together, their heads erect and their ears pitched forward at the sound of Miller's gunfire. He got on his own horse and set it at a gallop across the valley to their camp. At his approach, Charlie Hodge looked up from his work. He had spent the morning of the other men's absence felling a number of slender aspens and dragging them to the scattered trees at the edge of their camp. "Give me a hand with some of these poles," Charlie called to him as he dismounted. "Trying to set up a corral for the livestock." "Miller's got a stand of buffalo," Andrew said. "He wants a fresh rifle and some cartridges, and some water." "God," Charlie Hodge said. "His name be praised." He dropped the aspen pole that, with the crook of his bad arm, he had half lifted up across the trunk of a pine, and scurried toward the canvas-covered store of goods near the rock chimney. "How many head?" 250, 300, maybe more." "God," Charlie Hodge said. "If they don't scatter, it'll be as big a stand as he ever had." From the covered framework of pine boughs, Charlie Hodge pulled an ancient rifle whose stock was nicked and stained and split at one point, the split being closed by tightly wound wire. "This here's just an old Ballard, nothing like the Sharps, but it's a 50, and he can use it enough to cool his good gun off. And here's some shells, 2 boxes, all we got. With what he filled last night ought to be enough." Andrews took the gun and the shells, in his haste and nervousness dropping a box of the latter. "And some water," Andrews said, stopping to retrieve the box of shells. Charlie Hodge nodded and went across the spring, where he filled a small wooden keg. Handing it to Andrews, he said, "Get a little of this warm before you use it on a rifle barrel, or don't let the barrel get too hot. Cold water on a real hot barrel can ruin it mighty quick." Andrews, mounted on his horse, nodded. He clasped the keg to his chest with one arm and reined the horse away from the camp. He pointed his horse toward the sound of the gunfire, which still came faintly across the long, flat valley, and let the horse have its head. His arms tightly clasped the water keg and the spare rifle, and he held the reins loosely in one hand. He pulled his horse to a halt near the bend of the valley where Schneider was still dozing, and dismounted awkwardly, nearly dropping the keg of water in his descent. He wrapped the reins about a small tree, and made his way in a wide half-circle around the valley bend to where Miller, enveloped now in a light grey haze of gun smoke, lay on the ground and fired every 2 or 3 minutes into the milling herd of buffalo. Andrews crawled up beside him, carrying the water keg with one arm, and sliding the rifle over the slick grass with his other hand, which supported him. "How many of them have you got?" Andrews asked. Miller did not answer. He turned upon him wide, black-rimmed eyes that stared through him, blankly, as if he did not exist. Miller grabbed the extra rifle and thrust the sharps into Andrews' hands. Andrews took it by the stock and the barrel, and immediately dropped it. The barrel was painfully hot. "Clean her out," Miller said in a flat, grating voice. He thrust the cleaning rod toward him. "She's getting caked inside." Careful not to touch the metal of the barrel, Andrews broke the rifle and inserted the cleaning patch into the mouth of the barrel. "Not that way," Miller told him in a flat voice. "You'll foul the firing pin. Sup your patch in water and go through the breech." Andrews opened the keg of water and got the tufted end of the cleaning rod wet. When he inserted the rod into the breech of the barrel, the hot metal hissed, and the drops of water that got on the outside of the barrel danced for a moment on the blued metal and disappeared. He waited for a few moments and reinserted the patch. Drops of smoke-blackened water dripped from the end of the barrel. After cleaning the fouled gun, he took a handkerchief from his pocket, dipped it into the still cool spring water, and ran it over the outside of the barrel until the gun was cool. Then he handed it back to Miller. Miller shot and reloaded, and shot and loaded again. The acrid haze of gun smoke thickened around them. Andrews coughed and breathed heavily and put his face near the ground where the smoke was thinner. When he lifted his head, he could see the ground in front of him littered with the mounded corpses of buffalo, and the remaining herd, apparently little diminished, circling almost mechanically now in a kind of dumb rhythm, as if impelled by the regular explosions of Miller's guns. The sound of the guns firing deafened him. Between shots his ears throbbed dully, and he waited, tense in the pounding silence, almost dreading the next shot which would shatter his deafness with a quick burst of sound, nearly like pain. Gradually the herd, in its milling, moved away from them. As it moved, the two men crawled toward it, a few yards at a time, maintaining their relative position to the circling buffalo. For a few minutes, beyond the heavy cloud of gun smoke, they could breathe easily, but soon another haze formed, and they were breathing heavily and coughing again. After a while, Andrews began to perceive a rhythm in Miller's slaughter. First, with a deliberate, slow movement that was a tightening of the arm muscles, a steadying of his head, and a slow squeeze of his hand, Miller would fire his rifle. Then quickly he would eject the still-smoking cartridge and reload. He would study the animal he had shot, and if he saw that it was cleanly hit, his eyes would search among the circling herd for a buffalo that seemed particularly restless. After a few seconds, the wounded animal would stagger and crash to the ground, and then he would shoot again. The whole business seemed to Andrews like a dance, a thunderous minuet created by the wildness that surrounded it. Once during the stand, several hours after Miller had felled the first of the buffalo, Schneider crawled up behind them and called Miller's name. Miller gave no sign that he heard. Schneider called again, more loudly, and Miller jerked his head slightly toward him, but still he did not answer. "Give it up," Schneider said. "You got 70 or 80 of them already. That's more than enough to keep Mr. Andrews and me busy half the night." "No," Miller said. "You got a good stand already," Schneider said. "All right, you don't have to—" Miller's hand tightened, and a shot boomed over Schneider's words. "Mr. Andrews here won't be much help, you know that," Schneider said, after the echoes of the gunshot had drifted away. "No need to keep on shooting more than we'll be able to skin." "We'll skin all we shoot, Fred," Miller said, "no matter if I shoot from now till tomorrow." "God damn it," Schneider said. "I ain't going to skin no stiff buff." Miller reloaded his gun and swung it around restlessly on the shooting stick. "I'll help you with the skinning if need be, but help you or not, you'll skin them, Fred. You'll skin them hot or cold, loose or hard. You'll skin them if they're bloated, or you'll skin them if they're froze. You'll skin them if you have to pry the hide loose with a crowbar. Now shut up and get away from here. You'll make me miss a shot." "God damn it," Schneider said. He pounded the earth with his fist. "All right," he said, raising himself up to a crouching position. "Keep them as long as you can. But I ain't going to—" "Fred," Miller said quietly, "when you crawl away from here, crawl away quiet. If these buffalo spook, I'll shoot you." For a moment Schneider remained in his low crouch. Then he shook his head, dropped to his knees, and crawled away from the two men in a straight line, muttering to himself. Miller's hand tightened, his fingers squeezed, and a shot cracked in the thudding quietness. It was the middle of the afternoon before the stand was broken. The original herd had been diminished by 2/3. In a long, irregular swath that extended beyond the herd for nearly a mile, the ground was littered with the dark mounds of dead buffalo. Andrew's knees were raw from crawling after Miller, as they made their way yard by yard in slow pursuit of the southward list of the circling herd. His eyes burned from blinking against the gun smoke, and his lungs pained him from breathing it. His head throbbed from the sound of gunfire, and upon the palm of one hand blisters were beginning to form from his handling of the hot barrels. For the last hour he had clenched his teeth against any expression of the pain his body felt. But as the pain of his body increased, his mind seemed to detach itself from the pain, to rise above it, so that he could see himself and Miller more clearly than he had before. During the last hour of the stand, he came to see Miller as a mechanism, an automaton, moved by the moving herd. And he came to see Miller's destruction of the buffalo not as a lust for blood, or a lust for the hides, or a lust for what the hides would bring, or even at last the blind lust of fury that toiled darkly within him. He came to see the destruction as a cold, mindless response to the life in which Miller had immersed himself. And he looked upon himself, crawling dumbly after Miller upon the flat bed of the valley, picking up the empty cartridges that he spent, tugging the water keg, husbanding the rifle, cleaning it, offering it to Miller when he needed it. He looked upon himself and did not know who he was or where he went. Miller's rifle cracked. A young cow, hardly more than a calf, stumbled, got to its feet, and ran erratically out of the circling herd. "Damn it," Miller said without emotion. "A leg shot. That will do it." While he was speaking, he was reloading. He got another shot off at the wounded buffalo, but it was too late. On the second shot, the cow wheeled and ran into the milling herd. The circle broken, the herd halted and was still for a moment. Then a young bull broke away, and the herd followed, the mass of animals pouring out of their own wide circle, like water from a spout, until Miller and Andrews could see only a thin dark stream of bobbing humps thudding away from them down the winding bed of the valley. The two men stood erect. Andrews stretched his cramped muscles and almost cried aloud in pain as he straightened his back. "I thought about it," Miller said, speaking away from Andrews toward the dwindling herd. "I thought about what would happen if I didn't get a clean shot. So I didn't get a clean shot. I broke a leg. If I hadn't thought about it, I could have got the whole herd." He turned to Andrews. His eyes were wide and blank, the pupils unfocused and swimming in the whites. The unbearded skin of his face was black with the ash of gunpowder, and his beard was caked with it. "The whole herd," he said again, and his eyes focused upon Andrews, and he smiled a little with the corners of his mouth. "Was it a big stand?" Will Andrews asked. "I never had a bigger," Miller said. "Let's count them down." The two men began to walk down the valley, following the loose, spread-out trail of felled buffalo. Andrews was able to keep the numbers straight in his mind, until he had counted nearly 30, but his attention was dissipated by the sheer quantity of the dead beasts, and the numbers, he repeated to himself, spread in his mind and whirled as in a pool, and he gave up his effort to count. Dazedly, he walked beside Miller as they threaded their way among the buffalo, some of which had fallen so close together that their bodies touched. One bull had dropped so that its huge head rested upon the side of another buffalo. The head seemed to watch them as they approached, the dark, blank, shining eyes regarding them disinterestedly, then staring beyond them as they passed. The hot, cloudless sun beat down upon them as they plodded over the thick, spongy grass, and the heat raised from the dead animals a rank odor of must and wildness. The smooth, swishing sound that their boots made in the tall grass intensified the silence around them. The dull pulsations in Andrew's head began to subside, and after the acrid smell of gunpowder, the strong odor of the buffalo was almost welcome. He hitched the empty water keg to a more comfortable position on his shoulder and strode erect beside Miller. Schneider was waiting for them where the long swath of buffalo ended. He sat on the mounded side of a large bull. His feet barely reached the ground. Behind him, their horses grazed quietly, their reins knotted loosely together and trailing. "How many?" Schneider asked sadly. 135, Miller said. Schneider nodded somberly. "About what I figured." He slid off the side of the buffalo and picked up his case of skinning knives, which he had put on the ground beside the felled bull. "Might as well get started," he said to Andrews. "We got a long afternoon and a long night ahead of us." He turned to Miller. "You going to help?" For a moment Miller did not answer. His arms hung long at his sides, his shoulders drooped, and there was on his face an expression of emptiness. His mouth hung slightly open, and his head swung from side to side as he gazed upon the receding field of dead buffalo. He swung his body around to Schneider. "What?" he asked dully. "You going to help?" Miller brought his hands up, chest high, and opened them. The forefinger of his right hand was puffed and swollen, and curved inward toward his palm. Slowly he straightened it. Across the palm of his left hand, a long, narrow blister, pale against the grained blackness of the surrounding flesh, extended diagonally from the base of the forefinger to the heel of the palm near the wrist. Miller flexed his hands and grinned, standing erect. "Let's get this started," he said. Schneider beckoned to Andrews. "Get your knives and come with me." Andrews followed him to a young bull. The two men knelt together before it. "You just watch me," Schneider said. He selected a long curving blade and grasped it firmly in his right hand. With his left hand he pushed back the heavy collar of fur around the buffalo's neck. With his other hand he made a small slit in the hide and drew his knife swiftly from the throat across the belly. The hide parted neatly with a faint ripping sound. With a stubbier knife he cut around the bag that held the testicles, cut through the cords that held them and the limp penis to the flesh. He separated the testicles, which were the size of small crab apples, from the other parts of the bag and tossed them to one side. Then he slit the few remaining inches of hide to the anal opening. "I always save the balls," he said. "They make mighty good eating, and they put starch in your pecker, unless they come off an old bull. Then you better just stay away from them." With still another knife, Schneider cut around the neck of the animal, beginning at that point where he made the belly slit, and lifting the huge head up and supporting it on one knee so that he could cut completely around the throat. Then he slit around each of the ankles and ripped down the inside of each leg until his knife met the first cut down the belly. He loosened the skin around each ankle until he could get a handhold on the hide, and then he shucked the hide off the leg until it lay in loose folds upon the side of the buffalo. After he had laid the skin back on each leg, he loosened the hide just above the hump until he could gather a loose handful of it. Upon this, he knotted a thin rope that he got from his saddlebag. The other end he tied to his saddle horn. He got in the saddle and backed his horse up. The hide peeled off the buffalo as the horse backed. The heavy muscles of the bull quivered and jerked as the hide was shucked off. "And that's all there is to it," Schneider said, getting down from his horse. He untied the rope from the bull hide. "Then you spread it out flat on the ground to dry, fur side up, so it won't dry out too fast." Andrews estimated that it had taken Schneider a little over 5 minutes to complete the job of skinning. He looked at the buffalo. Without its hide, it seemed much smaller. Yellowish-white layers of fat thinned upon the smooth blue twists of muscle. Here and there, where flesh had come off with the skin, dark clots of blood lay on the flesh. The head, with its ruff of fur and its long beard beneath the chin, appeared monstrously large. Andrews looked away. "Think you can do it?" Schneider asked. Andrews nodded. "Don't try to hurry it," Schneider said. "And don't pick an old bull. Stick to the young light ones at first." Andrews selected a bull about the same size as the one Schneider had skinned. As he approached it, it seemed to him that he shrank inside his clothes, which were suddenly stiff upon him. Gingerly, he pulled from his case a knife similar to the one Schneider had used, and forced his hands to go through the motions he had seen a few moments before. The hide, apparently so soft on the belly, offered a surprising resistance to his knife. He forced it, and felt it sink into the hide and deeper into the flesh of the animal. Unable to draw the knife in the smooth, easy sweep that he had observed Schneider use, he hacked an irregular cut across the belly. He could not make his hands touch the testicles of the buffalo. Instead, he cut carefully around the bag on both sides. By the time he had slit the hide on the legs and around the throat, he was sweating. He pulled at the hide on one of the legs, but his hand slipped. With his knife, he loosened the flesh from the hide and pulled again. The hide came from the leg with large chunks of flesh hanging upon it. He managed to get enough hide gathered at the hump to take the knot of his rope. But when he backed his horse up to pull it loose, the knot slipped, and the horse almost sat back on its haunches. He pulled a bit more of the hide loose and knotted the rope more firmly. The horse pulled again. The hide ripped from the flesh, half spinning the buffalo around. He backed his horse up, and the hide split, coming off the side of the buffalo and carrying with it huge hunks of meat. Andrews looked helplessly at the ruined hide. After a moment, he turned to seek out Schneider, who was busily engaged some 100 feet away, ripping at the belly of a large bull. Andrews counted 6 carcasses that Schneider had stripped during the time of his own work with a single one. Schneider looked in his direction, but he did not pause in his work. He knotted his rope about the hide, backed his horse up, and spread the shucked skin on the grass. Then he walked over to where Andrews waited. He looked at the ruined hide that still was attached to the rump of the buffalo. "You didn't get a clean pull," he said. "And you didn't cut even around the neck. If you cut too deep, you get into the meat, and that part pulls loose too easy. Might as well give this one up." Andrews nodded, loosened the knot around the hide, and approached another buffalo. He made his cuts more carefully this time, but when he tried to shuck the hide, again the hide split away as it had done before. Tears of rage came to his eyes. Schneider came up to him again. "Look," he said, not unkindly, "I don't have time to fool with you today. If Miller and I don't get these hides off in a few hours, these buffs will be stiff as boards. Why don't you drag a calf back to camp and dress it down? We need some meat anyhow, and you can work on the carcass, get the feel of it. I'll help you fix up a rig." Not trusting himself to speak, Andrews nodded. He felt a hot, irrational hatred for Schneider welling up in his throat. Schneider selected a young cow, hardly more than a calf, and looped a rope around its chin and neck. He pulled the rope short and knotted it around Andrew's saddle horn, so that with the pull of the horse the head of the buffalo did not drag on the ground. "You'll have to walk your horse back," Schneider said. "You'll have enough to do dragging this cow." Andrews nodded again, not looking at Schneider. He pulled the reins, and the horse leaned forward, its hooves slipping in the turf. But the carcass of the young buffalo slid a little, and the horse gained its footing and began to strain its way across the valley. Andrews plodded tiredly before the horse, loosely pulling it forward by the reins. By the time he got back to the camp, the sun had gone behind the western range of mountains. There was a chill in the air that went through his clothing and touched his sweaty skin. Charlie Hodge trotted out from the camp to meet him. "How many?" Charlie Hodge called. "Miller counted 135, Andrews said. "Ah, God," Charlie Hodge said. "A big one." Near the camp, Andrews halted his horse and untied the rope from the saddle horn. "Nice little calf you got," Charlie Hodge said. "Make good eatin'. You gonna dress her down, or you want me to?" "I'll dress her," Andrews said, but he made no movement. He stood looking at the calf, whose open, transparent eyes were filmed over blankly with a layer of dust. After a moment, Charlie Hodge said, "I'll help you fix up a scaffold." The two men went to the area where earlier Charlie Hodge had been working on the corral for the livestock. The corral, roughly hexagonal in shape, had been completed, but there were still a few long aspen poles lying about. Charlie Hodge pointed out 3 of equal length, and they dragged them back to where the buffalo calf lay. They pounded the ends of the poles into the ground and arranged them in the form of a tripod. Andrews mounted his horse and lashed the poles together at the top. Charlie Hodge threw the rope, which was still attached to the calf's head, over the top of the tripod, and Andrews tied the loose end to his saddle horn. He backed his horse up until the calf was suspended, its hooves barely brushing the short grass. Charlie Hodge held the rope until Andrews returned to the tripod and secured the rope firmly to the top so that the buffalo would not drop. The buffalo hung. They surveyed it for a moment without speaking. Charlie Hodge went back to his campfire. Andrews stood before the hung calf. In the distance, across the valley, he saw a movement. It was Schneider and Miller returning. Their horses went in a swift walk across the valley bed. Andrews took a deep breath and put his knife carefully to the exposed belly of the calf. He worked more slowly this time. After he had made the cuts in the belly, around the throat, and around the ankles, he carefully peeled the hide back so that it hung loosely down the sides of the animal. Then, reaching high above the hump, he ripped the hide from the back. It came off smoothly, with only a few small chunks of the flesh adhering to it. With his knife he scraped the largest of these chunks off, and spread the skin on the grass, flesh side downward, as he had seen Schneider do. While he stood back, looking down at his hide, Miller and Schneider rode up beside him and dismounted. Miller, his face streaked with the black residue of powder smoke and smears of brownish-red blood, looked at him dully for a moment, and then looked at the hide spread on the ground. He turned and shambled unsteadily toward the campsite. "Looks like a clean job," Schneider said, walking around the hide. "You won't have no trouble. Of course, it's easier when your carcass is hanging." "How did you and Miller do?" Andrews asked. "We didn't get halfway through. We'll be working most of the night." "I wish I could help," Andrews said. Schneider walked over to the skinned calf and slapped the naked rump of it. Nice, fat little calf. She'll make good eating. Andrews went to the calf and knelt. He fumbled among the knives in his case. He raised his head to Schneider, but he did not look at him. What do I do? He asked. What? What do I do first? I've never dressed an animal before. My God, Schneider said quietly. I keep forgetting. Well, first you better de-gut her. Then I'll tell you how to cut her up. Charlie Hodge and Miller came around the tall chimney rock and leaned against it, watching. Andrews hesitated for a moment, then stood up. He pushed the point of his knife against the breastbone of the calf, and poked until he found the softness of the stomach. He clenched his teeth, and pushed the knife in the flesh, and drew the knife downward. The heavy, coiled blue and white guts, thicker than his forearm, spilled out from the clean edge of the cut. Andrews closed his eyes, and pulled the knife downward as quickly as he could. As he straightened up, he felt something warm on his shirt front. A gush of dark, half-clotted blood had dropped from the open cavity. It spilled upon his shirt and dripped down upon the front of his trousers. He jumped backward. His quick movement sent the calf rocking slowly on the rope and made the thick entrails slowly emerge from the widening cut. With a heavy, liquid, sliding thud, they spilled upon the ground. Like something alive, the edge of the mass slid toward Andrews and covered the tops of his shoes. Schneider laughed loudly, slapping his leg. "Cut her loose," he shouted. "Cut her loose before she crawls all over you." Andrews swallowed the heavy saliva that spurted in his mouth. With his left hand, he followed the thick, slimy main gut up through the body cavity. He watched his forearm disappear into the wet warmth of the body. When his left hand came upon the end of the gut, he reached his other hand, with the knife up beside it, and sliced blindly, awkwardly, at the tough tube. The rotten smell of the buffalo's half-digested food billowed out. He held his breath and hacked more desperately with his knife. The tube parted, and the entrails spilled down, gathering in the lower part of the body. With both arms, he scooped the guts out of the cavity until he could find the other attachment. He cut it away and tore the insides from the calf with desperate scooping motions until they spread in a heavy mass on the ground around his feet. He stepped back, pale, breathing heavily through his open mouth. His arms and hands, held out from his body, dripping with blood, were trembling. Miller, still leaning against the chimney rock, called to Schneider. "Let's have some of that liver, Fred." Schneider nodded and took a few steps to the swinging carcass. With one hand he steadied it, and with the other reached into the open cavity. He jerked his arm. His hand came out carrying a large piece of brownish-purple meat. With a few quick strokes of his knife, he sliced it in two, and tossed the larger of the pieces across to Miller. He caught the liver in the scoop of his two hands, and clutched it to his chest so that it would not slide out of his grasp. Then he lifted it to his mouth, and took a large bite from it. The dark blood oozed from the meat, ran down the sides of his chin, and dropped to the ground. Schneider grinned and took a bite from his piece. Still grinning, chewing slowly, his lips dark red from the meat, he extended the meat toward Andrews. "Want to chew?" he asked, and laughed. Andrews felt the bitterness rise in his throat. His stomach contracted in a sudden spasm, and the muscles of his throat pulled together, choking him. He turned and ran a few paces from the men, leaned against a tree, doubled over, and retched. After a few minutes he turned to them. "You finish it up," he called to them. "I've had enough." Without waiting for a reply, he turned again and walked toward the spring that trickled down some 75 yards beyond their camp. At the spring he removed his shirt. The blood from the buffalo was beginning to stiffen on his undershirt. As quickly as he could, he removed the rest of his clothing and stood in the late afternoon shadow, shivering in the cool air. From his chest to below his navel was the brownish-red stain of buffalo blood, and in removing his clothing, his arms and hands had brushed against other parts of his body, so that he was blotched with stains, hued from a pale vermilion to a deep brownish crimson. He thrust his hands into the icy pool formed by the spring. The cold water clotted the blood, and for a moment he feared that he could not remove it from his skin. Then it floated away in soft tendrils, and he splashed water on his arms, his chest, and his stomach, gasping at the cold, straining his lungs to gather air against the repeated shocks of it. When he had removed from his naked body the last flecks of blood he could see, He knelt on the ground and wrapped his arms around his body. He was shivering violently, and his skin had a faintly bluish cast. He took his clothing, article by article, and immersed it in the tiny pool. He scrubbed it as hard as he could, wringing each article out thoroughly and resubmerging it several times, until the water was muddied and tinged with a dirty red. Finally, with bits of fine gravel and soil gathered from the thin banks of the pool, he scrubbed at his blood-stained boots. But the blood and slime from the buffalo had entered into the pores of the leather, and he could not scrub the stain away. He put the wet and wrinkled clothing back on and walked back to the camp. By this time it was nearly dark, and his clothing was stiff with the cold by the time he got to the campfire. The buffalo had been dressed. The innards, the head, the hooves, and the lean, bony sides had been dragged away from the campsite and scattered. On a spit over the fire, which was smoking and flaming higher than it should have been, was impaled a large chunk of the hump meat. Beside the fire, on a square of dirty canvas, in a dark, irregular pile, was the rest of the meat. Andrews went up to the fire and put his body against the heat. From the wrinkles of his clothing rose little wisps of steam. None of the men spoke to him. He did not look directly at them. After a few moments, Charlie Hodge took a small box from the canvas-covered cache and examined it by the light of the fire. Andrew saw that it contained a fine white powder. Charlie Hodge went around the chimney rock toward the scattered remains of the buffalo, muttering to himself as he went. "Charlie's out wolfing," Miller said to no one. "I swear, he thinks a wolf is the devil himself." "Wolfing?" Andrews spoke without turning. "You sprinkle strychnine over raw meat," Miller said. "You keep it up a few days around a camp, you won't have any trouble with wolves for a long time." Andrews turned so that his back received the heat of the campfire. When he turned, the front of his clothing immediately cooled, and the still wet cloth was icy on his skin. "But that ain't the reason Charlie does it," Miller said. "He looks at a dead wolf like it was the devil himself, killed." Schneider, squatting on his haunches, rose and stood beside Andrews, sniffing hungrily at the meat, which was beginning to blacken around the edges. "Too big a piece," Schneider said. "Won't be done for an hour. A body gets a hunger skinning all day, and he needs food if he's going to skin all night." "It won't be so bad, Fred," Miller said. "There's a moon, and we'll get a little rest before the meat's done." "It gets any colder," Schneider said, "and we'll be prying loose stiff hides." Charlie Hodge came into sight around the chimney rock, which now loomed dark against the light sky. He carefully placed the box of strychnine back in its cache, dusted his hands off on his trouser legs, and inspected the buffalo roast. He nodded, and set the coffee pot on the edge of the fire, where some coals were beginning to glow dully. Soon the coffee was boiling. The aroma of the coffee and the rich odor of the meat dripping and falling into the fire blended and came across to the men who waited for their food. Miller smiled, Schneider cursed lazily, and Charlie Hodge cackled to himself. Instinctively, remembering his revulsion earlier at the sight and odor of the buffalo, Andrews turned away from the rich smells, but he realized suddenly that they struck him pleasantly. He hungered for the food that was being prepared. For the first time since he had returned from his cold bath at the spring, he turned and looked at the other men. He said sheepishly, "I guess I didn't do so good, dressing the buffalo." Schneider laughed. "You tossed everything you had, Mr. Andrews." "It's happened before," Miller said. "I've seen people do worse." The moon, nearly full, edged over the eastern range. As the fire died, its pale bluish light spread through the trees and touched the surfaces of their clothing, so that the deep red glow cast by the coals was touched by the cold pale light, where the two colors met on their bodies. They sat in silence until the moon was wholly visible through the trees. Miller measured the angle of the moon and told Charlie Hodge to take the meat, done or not, off the spit. Charlie Hodge sliced great chunks of the half-done roast onto their plates. Miller and Schneider picked the meat up in their hands and tore it with their teeth, holding it sometimes in their mouths while they snapped their fingers from the heat. Andrews sliced his meat with one of his skinning knives. The meat was tough but juicy, and it had the flavor of strong, undercooked beef. The men washed it down with gulps of scalding, bitter coffee. Andrews ate only a part of the meat that Charlie Hodge had given him. He put his plate and cup down beside the fire and lay back on his bedroll, which he pulled up near the fire, and watched the other men wordlessly gorge themselves on the meat and coffee. They finished what Charlie Hodge had given them and ate more. Charlie Hodge himself ate almost delicately from a thin slice of the roast, which he cut into very small pieces. He washed down the small bites he took with frequent sips of coffee that he had strongly laced with whiskey. After Miller and Schneider had finished the last bit of the hump roast, Miller reached for Charlie Hodge's jug, took a long swallow, and passed the jug to Schneider, who turned the jug up and let the liquor gurgle long in his throat. He swallowed several times before he handed the jug to Andrews, who held the mouth of the jug against his closed lips for several seconds before taking a small, cautious swallow. Schneider sighed, stretched, and lay on his back before the fire. He spoke from deep in his throat, his voice a soft, slow growl. The belly full of buffalo meat, and a good drink of whiskey. All a body would need now is a woman. There ain't no sin in buffalo meat nor corn whiskey, said Charlie Hodge. But a woman now, that's a temptation of the flesh. Schneider yawned and stretched again on the ground. Remember that little whore back in Butcher's Crossing? He looked at Andrews. What was her name? Francine, Andrews said. Yeah, Francine. My God, that was a pretty whore. Wasn't she kind of heated up for you, Mr. Andrews? Andrews swallowed and looked into the fire. I didn't notice that she was. Schneider laughed. Don't tell me you didn't get into that. My God, the way she kept looking at you. You could have had it for damn near nothing. Or nothing, come to think of it. She said she wasn't working. How was it, Mr. Andrews? Was it pretty good? Leave it, Fred, Miller said quietly. I want to know how it was, Schneider said. He raised himself on one elbow. His round face, red in the dull glow of the coals, peered at Andrews. There was a fixed, tight smile on his face. All soft and white, he said hoarsely, and licked his lips. What did you do? Tell me what— That's enough, Fred, Miller said sharply. Schneider looked at Miller angrily. What's the matter? I got a right to talk, ain't I? You know it's no good thinking about women out here, Miller said. Thinking about what you can't have will drive you off your feed. Jezebels, Charlie Hodge said, pouring another cup of whiskey, which he warmed with a bit of coffee. The work of the devil. What you don't think about, Miller said, you don't miss. Come on, let's get after those hides while we have some good light. Schneider got up and shook himself, as an animal might after having been immersed in water. He laughed, clearing his throat. Hell, he said, I was just having me some fun with Mr. Andrews. I know how to handle myself. Sure, Miller said. Let's get going. The two men walked away from the campfire to where their horses were tethered at a tree. Just before they went beyond the dim circle of light cast by the campfire, Schneider turned and grinned at Andrews. But the first thing I'm going to do when we get back to Butcher's Crossing is hire myself a little German girl for a couple of days. If you get in too much of a hurry, Mr. Andrews, you might just have to pull me off. Andrews waited until he heard the two men ride away, and watched as they loped across the pale bed of the valley, until their dark bobbing shapes merged into the darker rise of the western range of mountains. Then he slid into his bedroll and closed his eyes. He listened for a long while as Charlie Hodge cleaned the utensils he had used for cooking and tidied the camp. After a while there was silence. In the darkness, Andrews ran his hand over his face. It was rough and strange to its touch. The beard, which he was constantly surprised to feel upon his face, distracted his hands and made his features unfamiliar to him. He wondered how he looked. He wondered if Francine would recognize him, if she could see him now. Since the night when he had gone up to her room in Butcher's Crossing, he had not let himself think of her. But with Schneider's mention of her name earlier in the evening, thoughts of her flooded upon him. He was not able to keep her image away. He saw her as he had seen her in those last moments in her room before he had turned and fled. Seeing her in his mind, he turned restlessly upon his rough bed. Why had he run away? From where had come that deadness inside him that made him know he must run away? He remembered the sickness in the pit of his stomach, the revulsion which had followed hard upon the vital rush of his blood, as he had seen her stand naked and swaying slowly, as if suspended by his own desire, before him. In the moment before sleep came upon him, he made a tenuous connection between his turning away from Francine that night in Butcher's Crossing and his turning away from the gutted buffalo earlier in the day, here in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. It came to him that he had turned away from the buffalo not because of a womanish nausea at blood and stench and spilling gut. It came to him that he had sickened and turned away because of his shock at seeing the buffalo, a few moments before proud and noble and full of the dignity of life, now stark and helpless, a length of inert meat, divested of itself, or his notion of itself, swinging grotesquely, mockingly, before him. It was not itself, or it was not that self that he had imagined it to be. That self was murdered, and in that murder he had felt the destruction of something within him, and he had not been able to face it. So he had turned away. Once again, in the darkness, his hand came from beneath the covers and moved across his face, sought out the cold, rough bulge of his forehead, followed the nose, went across the chapped lips, and rubbed against the thick beard, searching for his features. When sleep came upon him, his hand was still resting on his face.